Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. What would you think if I told you we heard the weeping woman at a family reunion? Good evening, everyone. This happened several years ago at a family party we threw for my Uncle Paul's birthday. We went to a piece of land the family owned out in Colorado, near a dry creek bed that only fills up during the rainy season. At that time, it was the rainy season, so you can imagine how it looked. It's a remote place with trees, grass, and space to set up speakers, tables, and a tent to cook big meals. During the day, everything was normal. Music, kids running around, food, beers. As night fell, people started heading home. By around 2 a.m, only the most stubborn ones remained, about 8 men and 4 women, wives of some of them. We were sitting around an improvised fire pit, drinking and talking nonsense, already pretty tipsy. That's when someone turned down the speaker volume because they thought they heard something. Did you hear that? What? We all went quiet, and that's when we heard it. A long crying sound, like someone was weeping far away in the woods. But it wasn't normal crying, it was strange. Very high-pitched, painful. One of the women said, "It's a girl, she must be asking for help." One of my cousins, the drunkest one, said it was probably some woman who'd been hurt and he was going to go check. But when he took 2 steps toward the darkness, that crying changed. It became louder, as if suddenly that woman was closer. And it echoed clearly, as if it had been screamed from the creek. That's when we all froze. The women started screaming. One of my uncles dropped his beer and grabbed a hunting knife. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was talking. We all looked at each other, knowing that this wasn't normal. There was no way someone could scream like that with such a deep, ancient voice. It was like it came from the wind itself. A scream that gives you chills. One of us tried to turn the music back on to break the silence, but the speaker wouldn't turn on. That woman screamed again, and that's when our fire went out suddenly, without wind, without reason. The temperature in the air became freezing. Some of the women started crying from fear. We quickly got into the trucks. Nobody wanted to talk on the way back. We arrived at my grandmother's house, and nobody slept that night. The next day we went to check out that place. Everything was intact, except for one thing. Around the fire pit, there were barefoot tracks in the dirt. Fresh mud prints, as if that woman had come out of the creek and walked around there. They say the weeping woman appears near the creek, and it became clear to me that early morning. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Richard Stevens. I'm 32 years old, I'm a graphic designer, and I live with my girlfriend Maya in Sacramento. Every so often we take short trips to disconnect from work and the city. We look for quiet places, away from the noise, but that can be covered in a single day. Nothing extreme. We like gentle hiking with good weather, marked trails, and no complications. That's why we chose the Sierra Nevada near Lake Tahoe. We'd heard wonderful things about that area. It's about 2 hours from Sacramento. And in cold season, according to what we were told, there's a light layer of snow between January and February. Not like in the extreme north, but enough to see the forest covered in white. These are landscapes we don't have close by, so we got excited. It was a weekend without commitments, and we wanted to do something different. We left in my car at 6 in the morning with light backpacks, thermos with coffee, GPS, and the park map we had downloaded from the official website. The idea was to enter from the east side, do the longest circular route, about 9 miles, and return through the same access point. Maya is careful. She always verifies the route, cell coverage, and weather. And that day there were no warnings. Clear skies, no storms, cold but tolerable temperature. We arrived at the park before 9. There were only 1 or 2 trucks parked near the trailhead. Everything was calm. The forest was covered by a thin layer of snow that crunched under our feet. The air felt clean, frozen, with that silence you only get when you're far from everything. We started the hike calmly, took photos, made brief stops to admire the rock formations, those natural columns the park is famous for. Up to the first half, everything was perfect. It was during the return that things started to go off track. We'd been walking for almost 3 hours when we decided to turn back. We used the map, checked our location on the phone's GPS, and followed the signs that indicated circular trail, return to east access. After 10 minutes, the path started going downhill more than we remembered, but we thought it was part of the design. Some routes have steeper descents on the return. The problem was that after 20 minutes, we returned to the same clearing where we had rested an hour earlier. We recognized it by a rock shaped like a bull's horn, and that's where something seemed strange to us. The sign at the fork had changed. Before it said, "Return High Viewpoint." Now it said, "Main Trail Climbing Zone." I told Maya that surely it had been turned by the wind or someone playing around. Sometimes people do those things. But when she approached the sign, she noticed something disturbing. The screws weren't loose. They were firmly nailed in another direction. It wasn't an accidental change. Someone had turned it intentionally. We checked the GPS again. The blue dot showed we were on the route, but the digital trail no longer matched what we were seeing. The path we were following disappeared around a tight curve that didn't appear on the map. We tried again. We took the path to the right, which should have been the return. 15 minutes later, we were back at the same clearing. It was on the 3rd time around that we started doubting logic. In that clearing, there were several white-trunked trees covered with greenish lichens, and one of them, which we hadn't paid attention to before, had an X-shaped mark carved into the bark. It wasn't deep, but it looked recent. When we passed there the first time, it wasn't there, I'm sure. I looked at those trees because they seemed beautiful for a photo. Maya looked at me pale. Who made it so quickly? I didn't know what to say. We chose another path again, this time to the left of the clearing, although it didn't appear on the map. It was narrow, covered with branches, but someone had walked it recently. It seemed stepped on by boots or human footprints. We walked about 30 minutes in a straight line, with the idea of coming out to another visible point of the park. But what we found stopped us cold. A new clearing with the same bull's horn-shaped rock. And now 2 trees had marks, an X and a kind of elongated diamond, as if someone was watching us and marking our presence every time we passed. The sun was starting to set. The temperature dropped drastically. We still had signal, but Maya's phone battery was already at 20%, and mine was the same. We sat on the rock to evaluate what to do. That's when we heard the footsteps. At first we thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but they were human footsteps. Light, measured, circling the clearing without entering, as if someone was walking in a circle but didn't want to be seen. Maya stood up suddenly. "We're being followed," she said in a low voice. "They're leaving us marks." The phone's flashlight barely illuminated a few yards. We spun quickly around the clearing, shouted, asked for help. Nobody responded. We didn't see anyone, but the noise continued, like quick footsteps moving away as soon as we approached. We returned to the center point. There were now 3 marks on the trees, an X, a diamond, and now a spiral carved cleanly, without snow on top, as if it had been made seconds before. The only idea that occurred to me was to leave my own mark. I used a stone and drew a cross on the ground right in front of the rock. I also left an empty snack bag hanging from a branch, something we could recognize if we came back there. And we left on another trail, the narrowest one that descended toward a kind of ravine. We walked half an hour until we lost all reference. The snow was getting thicker. The cold was getting into our ribs. We were thinking about camping in case we couldn't find an exit. We were already preparing for the worst. But then among the trees we saw a dim light. We thought it was a vehicle or a cabin. We ran toward it. It was a rusty post of an old hiking sign, almost completely covered with dry branches. But most importantly, it was in a known part of the park, less than half a mile from the east access. We didn't understand how we got there. It was as if we had been dropped back after being tested with something. We walked in silence toward the car. The snow was harder frozen. We reached the car shivering, not just from the cold. I started without saying a word. We didn't look back. Once in Sacramento, we reported the incident to the park's email. We didn't receive a response. We didn't expect one either. I checked online forums. I asked in hiking groups. A man from Fresno commented something. "The trees in the north have memory. What you do gets marked. If you don't know the trail, they test you." I didn't respond to him. There was no point. We didn't take it as something supernatural, but it was real, too real. Since that day, neither Maya nor I have gone hiking again. Not out of fear of getting lost, but because we don't want to meet again with something that watches us, that measures us, that decides how many times we're going to return to the same point until it approves letting us out. And the worst thing is thinking that maybe in that forest, there's someone else trapped in their own clearing, with new marks appearing every time they try to escape. For weeks we didn't talk about the subject, not with friends, not with family, not between ourselves. Silence was our way of digesting what happened, but the body doesn't forget so easily. I started waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning, as if I was still inside the forest, expecting to see another mark appear on my window, on the door, somewhere. Maya became more cautious. She refused to go out on the highway alone. She even avoided taking certain routes within the city. She changed her route to work to a longer one with more traffic. Something got deep inside her that night. The feeling of being watched by someone who never let themselves be seen. One Saturday, almost 2 months later, she told me, "We have to go back." I looked at her as if she was joking. "I'm serious," she insisted. "Something happened there. It's not finished." I refused. I told her it wasn't a good idea, that the best thing was to leave things as they were, that we had gotten out lucky, and that tempting fate further could turn against us. But she had already decided. It took her another month to convince me. We returned in April. It was no longer snow season. The park was dry, the trees looked different, and the routes seemed clearer. The access office now had a new sign with a QR code to download the map. We scanned it and compared it with the old one we had saved. There were minimal differences, but one detail left me frozen. The fork where we got lost no longer appeared. It wasn't that it was in another place. It simply no longer existed on the map. We entered through the same west access. Everything seemed normal. More visitors, even a group of cyclists and a couple of experienced hikers with poles and large backpacks. We agreed not to do the entire route. We just wanted to find the clearing. We walked calmly, nothing strange. The sun was warm, the sky clear. And yet, passing the first 4 miles, something began to feel familiar. A turn in the trail, a rock split in half, the fallen branch of an oak that seemed to have petrified. Then we saw it. The clearing, the bull's horn-shaped rock was still there, but there was no snow, no signs, no marks on the trees. Just a strange silence, one of those that isn't the absence of noise but the presence of something else. "Do you see it?" Maya asked in a low voice. I approached the trees, recognized the trunk where the X used to be. And there I noticed something very slight, as if the bark had closed over a wound. There were no visible carvings, but if you ran your hand over it, you felt the shape. A superficial indentation, almost imperceptible, erased marks, as if the forest had wanted to close its file. We sat on the rock, ate a little, drank water. We were there for something, but we didn't know exactly what we expected. After a while, Maya stood up and took a walk. She came back with a different expression. She told me, "Come, look at this." About 20 yards from the clearing, she found a small trail camera, one of those used to monitor wildlife. It was camouflaged in the branch of a pine tree, pointing toward the trail fork. It was old, with the housing covered in dust and moisture. It had no lights or apparent connection. We carefully took it down. "Do you think it's from the park?" I asked her. "I don't think so, it's not marked." I kept it in the backpack. We left without saying anything. 2 days later, I bought a new memory card and a compatible battery to be able to review the camera's contents. It had an SD card. I connected everything to my computer at home while Maya was in the kitchen. The folders had dates ranging from last year to just 3 weeks ago. There were photos, hundreds. Almost all captured the same thing, the clearing, the trees at different times of the day. But in some photos, we appeared. Maya and I walking, resting, discussing direction. In one, I'm standing marking the stone with a cross. In another, Maya is holding the empty snack bag. There's another one. We're standing looking toward the trees with the marks already visible. And in all of them, the camera wasn't in the direction from which we arrived. They were waiting for us. Maya came in at that moment. I showed her the photos without saying a word. She took a deep breath. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just sat down and started going through the images one by one. At the end, there was a video, a single clip without audio. It lasts 48 seconds. It shows the empty clearing. Then from the left, a human figure appears, wearing mountain clothes, a cap, and a backpack. They approach one of the trees and mark something on the bark with a knife. Then they look toward the camera, stay still, then turn around and disappear. Their face isn't visible, they're in shadow, but on their wrist, there's a red bracelet. just like the ones worn by volunteer guides at the park during high season. We called the park, asked if they used trail cameras to study visitor movement. They said no, that the only thing they monitored were the accesses and the use of protected areas. We didn't insist. We kept the camera, deleted the images, but not without first copying them to a USB that I hid in an old book in my library. Not because we believed someone was going to look for them, but because something told us they should be preserved. We no longer go hiking, but we continue traveling more carefully, and always checking the maps before and after the trip, in case something changes. In case someone else is also making marks in another forest with another name. And because out there, maybe there are more cameras pointing toward places where logic twists just a few degrees. Places where you're not lost, you're just being watched. Welcome, everyone. Before I begin this story, I'd like to know where you're listening from and what time you prefer to hear these tales. Feel free to leave comments below. Without further delay, let's begin. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Billings, Montana. Though I've been living and working across the northern states for over a decade now, I'm a heavy machinery operator. Bulldozers, excavators, cranes. For the past couple of years, I've been taking seasonal shifts in remote areas, mostly for highway construction projects in sparsely populated regions of the Northern Territories. When they offered me the job in Alaska, I didn't think twice. Good pay, expenses covered, and a chance to save up enough money to bring my daughter to live with me. She's been staying with her mother in Denver since the divorce. They told me it was a federal project to expand a highway between two ghost towns, Coldbrook and Summit Ridge, in the southeastern part of the state. A forested, rarely traveled region about 3 hours north of Fairbanks. The stretch was about 20 miles long. There was only an old dirt road that was used in winter for snowmobiles and dog sleds. Now they wanted to convert it into a supply route, connecting some new logistics depots they were building in Summit Ridge. Nothing unusual, at least on paper. The company was called North Cross Infrastructure. I'd never worked for them before, but they seemed professional. New uniforms, well-maintained machinery, pre-built camp housing, 3 meals a day, and safety protocols followed to the letter. The only peculiarity was the access control. The only road to the work site was controlled by the company itself, with a checkpoint at the trail entrance. A guard, a quiet guy named Eric, logged every vehicle that entered or left. Work trucks, supply vehicles, even the drones that flew for mapping surveys, everything went through there. And if you weren't on the days list, you didn't get in. The first few days were like any other job. We were divided into crews and had to advance about 1,500 feet of roadway daily, clearing a path through the forest with bulldozers, leveling the terrain, and clearing routes with excavators. We worked in pairs. I was teamed up with Louis, a guy from El Paso, good people, quiet, kept to himself mostly. We shared a cabin at the camp, each with our own bunk and individual heater. The weather was cold and damp, but not unbearable, normal for the area. The first warning came on the 5th day. It was 6 in the evening. We'd finished our shift and were in the cabin, ready for dinner. Someone slipped a paper under the door. We thought it was some internal notification, shift changes, inspection, whatever. But it wasn't. It was a crumpled piece of paper, handwritten with black pen. It said only one sentence: "Get out of here before Sunday." No signature, no date, just that. And the most unsettling part, the paper wasn't the kind we used at camp. It was old, yellowish, like it had been torn from a school notebook. Lewis and I went outside immediately to check. There was nobody outside. The hallway was empty. The other cabins had their lights off. The dining hall about 50 yards away had a couple of cooks serving the early arrivals. Nobody with the look of someone who had just been there. Nobody with the attitude of someone who had just left a threat. We mentioned it to the foreman the next day. He laughed. Probably a prank from the new guys. It always happens, especially with the Latino workers. Don't pay it any mind. But Lewis and I had experience with this kind of work. We'd been in Canadian mines, Nevada deserts. We knew when a prank was a prank, and when something didn't add up. Sunday came and went. Nothing happened. Until Monday, when one of the operators, Travis, a young white guy who operated a motor grader, didn't show up for his shift. We thought he was sick or had been reassigned, but by evening in the dining hall, rumors started spreading. Nobody had seen him leave, and according to the checkpoint log, his truck hadn't passed through the exit. Some said maybe he went through the forest on foot, others that he simply deserted and left at dawn. But that was impossible. The only access was guarded. There was no cell signal or alternative roads, just dense forest for miles and below freezing temperatures at night. And still, Travis didn't appear. The company reported it as voluntary abandonment. 2 days later, returning from our work zone, Lewis found another paper, this time folded inside his hard hat. "You didn't understand. Leave." Same handwriting, same pen, same paper texture. He showed it to the supervisors. They called security, reviewed cameras that only covered the entrances and dining hall, and found nothing. They said they'd do a general inspection, but we never saw them search the cabins. From that day on, I started feeling like we were being followed. In the forest, while we operated the machinery, we'd hear rustling beyond where the other crews were working. Not animals, not branches in the wind. Slow footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. Lewis heard them too, but he didn't say anything. We just focused on working, finishing the daily roadway section, and getting back to camp as soon as possible. One night I decided to go further. I took a powerful flashlight and left the camp perimeter, just about 100 yards into the forest. I wanted to know if someone was camping there, if there was a hidden tent, a blind spot, something. I found nothing. But when I returned, at our cabin door, I found a new note, this time more direct. There are things buried that shouldn't be dug up. I didn't tell Lewis anything. I just went in, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The next morning, something stopped the work. The crew in the West Zone, where they were removing an old section of the original road, reported finding human remains. The foreman confirmed it over radio. They suspended operations, called the central office. They said it was probably a lost hunter from years ago. But the strange thing was the location. The bones were right under the new roadway, about 30 inches deep, in horizontal position, as if they had been buried on purpose, not covered by a landslide or natural accident. The local coroner came by helicopter, escorted by 2 state police officers. They took samples and in less than 3 hours closed the case. Old remains, no evidence of crime. That's what they noted in the camp bulletin. But that same night, a cook told us quietly that the skull had a bullet impact, that he saw it before they covered it with the tarp. And that's when everything went sideways. The warning stopped, but the atmosphere became more tense. Workers started quitting. In 1 week, 6 workers left without saying goodbye, without going through the checkpoint. They just left their things behind. Eric, the entrance guard, confessed to us one night, "Something weird is happening here. I swear nobody has left, but there are fewer people every day." I tried to contact the union. Nobody responded. It was as if this project existed in a bubble, as if someone wanted us to finish it without asking questions. The last night I was there, I heard footsteps around the cabin. Not the ones from the wooden hallway, these were on the dirt, right against the wall. I got up with the flashlight, opened the door suddenly, and saw nobody. But on the ground, right at the entrance, there was a mark drawn with small stones, a circle with a cross made of twigs inside. I never left those stones there. I left the next morning. I told Lewis I was leaving due to family illness. He stayed, I don't know why. He never wrote to me afterward, and to this day, nobody has asked me for a version of what happened. But I remember well that last warning, written on a piece of torn cardboard, stuck inside the windshield of my truck. I never knew how it got there. It just said, "Roads don't expand, they awaken." And since then, every time I see an excavator breaking ground where there was nothing before, I can't help but wonder what it's uncovering. Or worse, who? I didn't plan to talk about this again. After abandoning the Alaska project, I tried to get on with my life. I returned to Seattle, where I have a small machinery repair shop, more as a backup than as primary income. I no longer accept contracts in remote areas. Since then, only local jobs, small projects, preferably in urban areas. Places where there are cameras, noise, traffic, places where the ground has been walked on too much to hide anything. But the Cold Brook to Summit Ridge project won't leave my head. For weeks after my return, I got into the habit of checking heavy equipment worker forums in the North, Facebook groups, subreddits, email chains that we share among veterans of certain contractors. I wanted to know if anyone was talking about what happened there, about the disappearances, the human remains, the warnings. Nothing. The only mention I found was on an old blog by a guy who claimed to have worked for North Cross Infrastructure in 2015. According to him, the company was dismantled in 2016 after internal documents about improper operations in protected Alaska zones were leaked. But that didn't add up because I worked with them in 2023. I saw their logos, signed papers, ate in their dining halls. That wasn't a blog, it was a warning disguised as an anecdote. But who really wrote it? I contacted Eric again, the entrance guard. I had gotten his email when I asked him for a copy of the entry log before leaving. I wrote to him straight up, asking if he was still working at the site. It took him 3 days to answer. His message was short: "I'm not there anymore, don't ask more. Nobody should go to that place. Delete this email." And then silence. I tried to locate Lewis. I searched for his number, his social media profiles, even asked some fellow workers in the machinery groups who knew him from before. Nobody knew anything about him. And then the letter arrived. No return address, in an envelope without stamps, as if someone had left it directly in my shop's mailbox. The paper folded in 4 in blue ink with firm handwriting. "Don't talk, don't upload photos, don't ask about Lewis." They took him because he didn't obey. The handwriting wasn't the same as the papers in Alaska. This was cleaner, more confident, as if written calmly. That scared me more. The other writing had urgency, this one had control. I made a decision. Before closing the chapter, I needed concrete proof, something that couldn't be denied. So I decided to review the only copy I had made of the project files. Not the official papers, but the satellite photos I had saved of the roadway. During the work, one of my secondary functions was to monitor the terrain with a thermal camera drone. We used it to avoid areas with underground currents or wildlife presence. Although I wasn't officially allowed to keep copies, I had saved some images on a USB hidden in my toolbox. When reviewing the photos one by one, I found one that left me frozen. It was an aerial image of the north zone of the roadway, taken the day before finding the human remains. At first glance, it showed nothing strange, dense forest with machinery lined up. But when adjusting the thermal contrast, 3 hot spots appeared in a straight line, a few yards from where we were digging. 3 bodies, or what at least seemed to be bodies. Elongated shapes with heat patterns like those left by a living human or something recently buried. I compared that image with one taken 2 days later, when Earth had already been removed from that section. The spots had disappeared. But the most disturbing thing was that in the later image, in the lower corner, a figure appeared, not in thermal, but in shadow. A silhouette standing very close to the drone, in an area where nobody was authorized. It was no longer just about warnings or disappearances. Someone knew exactly what we were looking for, and even more, they let us see just enough to understand that we weren't in control. I closed the file, broke the USB with pliers, buried it in a sealed bag inside an empty lot next to my shop. Not out of fear that they would find it, but out of fear that they would force me to see it again. Since then, I sleep with my phone turned off. I don't use social media. I just maintain the shop and take jobs by referral that come through word of mouth. But recently, a new client came to ask for a quote for a job. He wore coveralls without a logo, but you could tell he had experience with machinery. He gave me an address in Alaska. The location was a coordinate. When I ran it through the system, I realized it was 12 miles north of Summit Ridge, and the project was called North Cross Phase 2. I told him I wasn't available. He didn't insist, just smiled, thanked me for my time, and left. Since then, every morning when I open the shop, I check the door twice. I walk to the mailbox even though I know it's empty. I stop in front of the window, expecting to find another envelope without a return address. But it hasn't arrived. Not yet. And I don't know what scares me more, that it will come again, or that I'll be the next one who doesn't come back out. My name is Anthony Sullivan, and for years I was a fisherman on the Northern Hope, a fishing boat that sailed the waters off the Alaskan coast. Life at sea always seemed to me one of the most peaceful, and at the same time, one of the most fearsome. However, what happened that night changed my vision forever. The reason I'm here telling this story isn't to scare you or to look for answers. It's more of an attempt to release the weight I carry, the uneasiness that hasn't left me since that storm. If you manage to understand my story, maybe you can comprehend what really happened on the high seas. Maybe you won't understand it, but the idea that someone else knows my experience relieves me. I had set sail 3 days earlier with a crew of experienced men. Everything seemed normal. The weather was cool and the sea calm, typical of that season. Our mission was simple: to fish in the waters rich in salmon and halibut that were located several miles from the coast. Nothing we would see or experience during those days indicated that something was going to go out of the ordinary. That night was different. On the horizon, clouds began to accumulate like a black wall that seemed to grow with each minute. The wind changed direction and intensified rapidly. As the sea became more agitated, the captain, an experienced man named Louis, decided it was better to return to port. However, the storm was already upon us. The waves rose like water monsters, hitting the structure of the boat with fury. The following hours turned into a nightmare. The storm was not only more intense than we had anticipated, but it seemed to have no end. The noise of the rain, the creaking of the boat's wood, and the roar of thunder enveloped everything. We tried to maintain calm, but the feeling of helplessness before the fury of the ocean was undeniable. The captain ordered everyone to remain at their posts. I was in the hold checking equipment when I heard something that made me stop. A light tapping, as if something or someone were moving inside the hold. I thought it was the boat swaying, that the waves were hitting the structure, but that sound didn't match. It was more specific, almost as if something were dragging across the wooden floor. I leaned in and tried to listen better. The first thing I thought was that some animal had snuck onto the boat, a rat maybe. Although honestly, it wasn't common for us to see animals on board. I decided to go down to the hold level to investigate. The darkness in the hold was almost total, except for the dim light that came from a lantern hanging near the door. The boat moved violently, and every time the hull made contact with the water, I felt the floor vibrate under my feet. I advanced cautiously, but there were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. However, the noise persisted, now clearer. Something was scraping the wooden walls. The first thing that came to mind was that it was probably a noise caused by water entering through some crack in the hull. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore. A breathing low, heavy, as if someone were crouching in the darkness trying to stay silent. My heart began to beat hard, and I stayed still waiting for the sound to dissipate, but it didn't. I decided to take a few more steps toward the interior of the hold, my flashlight trembling in my hands. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation, but every time I advanced, the air became denser, heavier, and the tapping became something more irregular, as if someone were walking slowly, almost dragging themselves. When I was about to turn around to return, the sound stopped abruptly. The quietness was even more disturbing. I stood there in silence, listening to the storm roar outside the boat. But then a loud noise, as if a wooden box had fallen to the floor, broke the calm. I quickened my pace and reached the back of the hold. In the darkness, I saw something that chilled my blood, a shadow moving quickly between the shelves. It wasn't possible. I knew I was alone, that there was no one else on the boat. My shift partner, Javier, was on deck. The captain was in the cabin, and the other men were scattered around the boat, working or trying to secure the ropes. My mind began to form absurd theories, but the only conclusion I could reach was that someone else was in the hold. I decided not to wait any longer and quickly returned toward the stairs that led to the deck, not daring to turn around. When I reached the door, I heard the same noise again. Something was sliding, moving stealthily. Suddenly, a strong blow coming from the shelves made me jump. At that instant, I felt I had to get out of there. With fear taking over me, I ran down the hallway, climbed the stairs, and went outside. The cold wind hit me immediately, and the storm continued roaring over us. I couldn't understand what had happened, but something in the hold told me I wasn't alone, something that had no form, that wasn't human. I ran toward the bridge, where the captain and the other men were fighting with the sails. I mentioned what I had heard and seen, but none of them seemed to pay attention to me. I was so overwhelmed by fear that I couldn't even go back to the hold to investigate. What had that been? A shadow, a noise, an illusion. The storm continued for hours. The wind tore at the sails, the waves hit hard, and everything seemed to become more chaotic. During that time, the feeling that something was lurking from the depths of the boat didn't leave me. Despite the others trying to maintain calm, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. And the storm became increasingly intense, as if the sea itself were trying to swallow us. It wasn't until dawn when the storm began to subside. The sea became calm and the wind finally stopped. But throughout the night, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow sliding in the hold. I never knew what really happened that night, if my mind was playing tricks, if fear had made me see things, or if there really was something else on that boat. I never went back to that hold. For weeks I felt watched in every corner of the boat. Every time I heard any strange noise or the creaking of wood. The others never believed me. The captain, although concerned about the storm, saw nothing strange. Maybe I was paranoid, or maybe there was truth, something that fed on fear and the silence of the storm. The only thing I know is that after that night, I never felt safe on the high seas. There was always something else in the water, something that couldn't be seen, but that was felt. And every time I see the ocean, a small part of me fears that it's still there waiting in the darkness. Surely you like ghost stories as much as I do, but believe me, you wouldn't want to run into one. That time I moved into an apartment building because it was cheap and close to the university. The neighborhood wasn't the best, but the apartment had what I needed. There was just one strange detail: the upstairs apartments were empty. I found this out because the doorman mentioned it when he gave me the keys, and started telling me that after midnight I shouldn't go upstairs, or if I did, not to get scared if I saw something. I just laughed, thinking he was trying to scare me. The first night I slept there, I was woken up by a sound. Someone was crying. It was muffled female crying, like she was trying to contain it. I thought it would be some neighbor, so I covered myself with pillows and went back to sleep. Days passed, and the crying repeated itself always after 2 in the morning. She would cry for long minutes. Sometimes she would say words between sobs, but very quietly. What did I do? Where am I? That was the only thing you could understand. One morning, when I had a day off from work, I went up to the roof to wash clothes at the laundry area. Little by little, the neighbor women started arriving, and I began greeting them and asking them things. When I had more confidence, I said to some who were there, "Hey, and that woman who cries in the early morning hours, who is she?" They all went quiet like they were worried, and one broke the silence with a laugh and said, "That woman doesn't exist." She told me nobody knew who she was. Everyone heard her in the early morning, but she was a ghost. According to her, the owner bought that place because it was somewhat cheap, since nobody would buy it. Because several girls had been dumped there, and it was rumored that one of them couldn't rest in peace. I didn't know what to say. I just crossed myself, and they did too. I also thought they were playing a joke on me. That same night, I recorded that crying with my phone. I told my family that the place was haunted. I sat in the living room, waited, and right at 2:20 in the morning, the crying started. I recorded it, but when I played it back the next day, you could only hear a buzzing like static. This gave me a lot of curiosity, so I decided to go upstairs at night. The apartment door was closed. I looked through the window, but everything was empty. Nobody was living on that floor, and that scared me even more. Somewhat incredulous, but already full of fear, I told that troubled soul that I was sorry for what had happened to her, but that she had to leave now and rest in peace. I tried to help her, but I think I made it worse. That night I couldn't sleep, and the crying returned. But this time it didn't come from upstairs, it came from my bathroom. You could hear the echo. I got up as best I could, trembling I approached, and when I touched the handle, that crying stopped. But then I heard a lament behind me. It wasn't a scream, it was a whisper right in my ear. I turned around terrified, and I still remember that out of the corner of my eye, as I turned I could see something, a girl my height. But obviously, there was nothing behind me. I ran out of the building terrified, barely able to walk and crying a lot. I found the doorman and told him. He kindly accompanied me on the street until my Uber arrived. I went to sleep at my mom's house. A week later, I returned for my things. I'm fearful, and I couldn't take this lightly like the people who live there. When I arrived, the doorman just said, "I told you not to go upstairs at night." This experience has been one of the worst I've had in my life, and I wanted to share it with you. My name is Hector, and I was never one of those who fear the mountains. In fact, I've always found in them a refuge, a place where tranquility reigns, away from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. This love for nature led me to plan an excursion to the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, a mountain range I had always wanted to explore. It wasn't my first time camping, but this time the storm wasn't the only thing that pursued me. And although I don't want to sound exaggerated, something darker than the storm itself stalked me that night. Everything began on a Friday morning. The idea was simple: go out walking during the day, establish my camp in a small meadow I knew from references of other hikers, and spend the night alone with the sound of the wind as my only company. As always, I carried the essentials: a tent, enough food for the day, water, and a flashlight. I wasn't afraid of common dangers. I was prepared to face any minor inconvenience. But the mountain has a strange way of teaching lessons, and mine came to me with a fury I didn't expect. The hike went peacefully during the first hours. The sun remained bright on the horizon, and the landscape of the mountains enveloped me with its majestic calm. I felt free, but something in the air began to change as I advanced toward my destination. The sky, which until then had been clear, began to turn gray. In the distance, I saw that clouds were accumulating rapidly, as if they were being dragged by some invisible force. The first thing that came to mind was that the storm would reach me soon. I had already heard that the mountains in the area are unpredictable, but still, I didn't worry too much. I had the tent and enough time to set it up. When I reached the meadow where I planned to camp, the first drops of rain were already beginning to fall. I decided to quickly set up camp before the storm unleashed with all its force. The tent was well secured, and I had already made my fire when the rain turned into something much more intense. The wind lashed against the slopes, and the noise of the storm seemed to want to swallow everything in its path. Despite the ferocity of the rain and wind, the feeling of isolation made me feel more alive than ever. I was in the heart of the mountain, surrounded by its indomitable power. That night I took refuge in the tent while outside the storm overflowed. Through the walls of the tent, I heard how the wind and rain crashed against the ground, creating a chaotic symphony that kept me alert. The darkness was total. I was completely alone, with no other light than that of my flashlight, which flickered with the wind gusts. As the night progressed, the storm intensified, and with it the sensation that something else was moving in the darkness. At first I thought it was just the noise of the storm. However, I began to notice a strange sound, something that didn't correspond to the wind or the rain. It was a soft, irregular tapping, as if something were moving near my tent, just out of reach of the flashlight. I got up from my sleeping bag and cautiously peered through the tent window. The wind shook the branches of nearby trees, and the rain kept falling relentlessly. There was nothing visible, just the wind. I told myself, but the sound persisted. It hit the tent intermittently, almost as if someone were touching the canvas softly. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to calm down. Nature, I thought, can be unpredictable, and sometimes strange noises are just part of its chaos. But then the knock repeated, this time a little stronger. Something or someone was nearby. My heart started beating faster, and although I didn't want to admit it, a part of me feared what might be lurking in the darkness. I decided it would be best to wait for the storm to subside, but fear began to take shape. The tapping continued ever closer, and it was no longer just a sporadic knock, but a constant rhythm, as if I were being followed. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I couldn't avoid the temptation. I took the flashlight firmly and peered out of the tent, hoping to see some creature or some animal that might have been trapped by the storm. There was nothing, just the rain falling relentlessly, the shadows swaying in the wind, and the constant whisper of water on the ground. Nothing seemed out of place. However, when I went back inside, a feeling of discomfort enveloped me. There was something I couldn't put into words, something that told me I wasn't alone. The tapping had stopped, but the air was charged, dense. There was no wind. The storm had calmed down a bit, and the darkness felt deeper, heavier. I felt the need to check the surroundings, but a strange sensation of paralysis stopped me. I was too scared to go out again. It was then that I heard the whisper. It wasn't the whisper of the wind or the trees. It was something closer, something that came from outside my tent. I didn't understand the words, but there was something in the cadence of that sound that chilled my blood. It was like a language I couldn't recognize, but which invaded me with a sensation of imminent danger. Something wasn't right. My first reaction was to think it was the echo of my own mind. But then I felt a tapping again, this time against the tent canvas, followed by a creak. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that was stalking, waiting for me to lower my guard. Without thinking more, I took my backpack and prepared to run out, not knowing if I should go look for help or simply get away as fast as possible. But just when I opened the tent entrance, I saw something that paralyzed me. Tracks. Some strange tracks in the wet earth. They weren't the tracks of a common animal, nor those of a human being. They were deep, elongated tracks that extended along the ground toward the darkness of the mountain. My heart beat hard. Something had left them, and something or someone was following those tracks, following them with a determination that made me doubt my own sanity. Without thinking more, I decided not to stay there. I gathered my equipment, turned off the flashlight, and went into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but I felt I had to escape. The mountain that before had given me a sensation of peace now seemed like a labyrinth of shadows, of invisible presences that lurked. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what might be following me, whatever had left those tracks. When I finally reached the town, soaked, exhausted, and terrified, I didn't talk to anyone about what had happened. But that silence, that disturbing echo remains present in my mind, even now when the storm seems to have calmed down. I've never returned to the mountain. I've never looked for an explanation for the tracks or for the whisper I heard that night. What happened there in the darkness remains a mystery to me. I only know that the mountain in its grandeur and solitude keeps secrets that perhaps it's better not to unveil. And in the quiet of the night, when I close my eyes, I still hear that distant echo, as if it were calling me again. Last weekend, I had to accompany my fiancée to visit her family who live on the outskirts of town, in one of those small communities that dot the edges of Taos, New Mexico, right near the Colorado border. I had no idea there were settlements so hidden away up there until we went for the first time. Her grandfather's ancestry comes from that area, so the family is pretty tight-knit, and it's common for those who live up there to come visit us, and vice versa. What made this occasion special was that one of her cousins who lives there was having her quinceañera celebration, and my future sister-in-law would be her sponsor. So we all set out in the morning to go to the church service in another town, and then continue the celebration back in the community I'm telling you about. At least, that was the plan. Well, in theory it did end up that way, though at first everything was a bit fragmented. Since I brought my pickup truck, they asked me to give rides to several family members, which honestly didn't bother me because I prefer to be doing something rather than just waiting around like the others had to do. I mention this because at the last minute I had to go pick up one of her uncles, who they call Pete, since he lost his right leg in a work accident and doesn't have much strength in his other leg anymore. So I had to help transport him. However, they warned me about his personality, saying that in any case I should listen to him when it came to the transportation, and not to insist too much on anything. I didn't know what to expect, but it turned out he was an extremely friendly guy. He lived a few blocks from the cousin's house, and this man is one of those people who have learned to embrace life, laugh at what happened to him, and doesn't worry much about what people think. As soon as I arrived, he explained how the process of taking him and getting him settled in the church would work, making jokes about his condition. Plus, he made me see and understand that as much as he wanted to be there, he would really be a burden and didn't want the others to worry about him. So he told me we could stay behind and wait for the others. After all, we were already 20 minutes late and wouldn't arrive on time, so I just followed orders and decided to stay with him. In fact, he told me that if anyone said anything, he would say it had been his decision. Honestly, that seemed better to me than being in a packed church in the middle of summer, especially since things were about to get better. Uncle Pete told me he had some beers in the refrigerator, and I went to get them. But just as I returned, a neighbor arrived with more drinks and asked me to store them while we cooled off. His friend was exactly like him, very friendly. So we quickly started chatting as if we were old friends, since they wouldn't stop joking with each other, now including me and everything. However, and without expecting it in any way, both of them told me one of the most incredible stories I've ever heard directly. And that's why I'm writing to your channel. When we were barely on our second beer, Uncle Pete's friend asked him what he was doing there and why there was no one else from the family around. So Pete explained, saying that he was a devil worshiper and hated church, that his only belief was alcohol, and that's why we were there enjoying it. Obviously, this was a joke to avoid having to explain how complicated it was to take him in his condition. However, before I could say anything, his friend jumped in and added more jokes to that comment. Then, I started understanding their dynamic better. After the jokes, Pete looked at me and said, "Of course I'm not a devil worshiper. I do go to church when I can. I'm not like this guy. Don't pay too much attention to him. He's angry with the church." He clearly said this pointing to his friend, who just showed an uncomfortable smile. I didn't know if it was another joke and let them continue, until Pete insisted that his friend tell me the story of his great-great-grandfather. He sat thinking and told me this story. His great-great-grandfather became the first pastor of the town many years ago, so he fought day and night to get them to build the first chapel there. A project that took him some time to get approved until he succeeded. However, from the beginning, he showed many inconsistencies and problems that arose day by day, to the point of seriously considering backing out. But he always remained insistent about it anyway, when the time came for other bishops to come see the progress. And although they told him he was on the right track, he had forgotten to get rid of the negative things the town had. This neighbor told me he didn't know much about the subject. It's what his family told him, and that's why he was having so many setbacks, because clearly something or someone didn't want them to put that symbol of God there. So he started doing rosaries around town, prayers, inviting the community to join together to foster Catholic unity there, which worked out quite well for him, since that chapel was making more and more progress. Several things were still missing, like finishing the facade, installing the doors, and the basic services. Then one night, this neighbor's great-great-grandfather pastor claimed that he had a strange visit in a dream in his room from a woman dressed completely in black. She wore a type of hat and veil that wouldn't let you see her face, who greeted him cordially and was very kind to him. At first, she started asking him several questions about why he studied to be a man of the church and what his intentions were in placing a chapel there. He answered these questions, and then he said the woman came closer and closer to him, but now making comments about how hypocritical religion was and the horrible things that have been done in its name. The woman was telling him this very angrily, and she assured his great-great-grandfather that this was to break his faith, which didn't happen, or at least that's what he thought. Before waking up, this woman told him that she herself was going to prove to him that the people of that town would be capable of worshiping any other figure without questioning anything. His great-great-grandfather denied it. He responded that it wasn't true, that she just wanted to provoke him, and fighting, he woke up. While remembering and thinking about what had happened in that nightmare, doing his morning routine, He noticed how many people from the town were walking toward the church, so he looked out to see what was happening. He saw how not only was it already finished, but they were about to hold a service. This was impossible. Several things still needed to be completed. He ran out at full speed to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him, and indeed he could see that project he had insisted on so much was finished. They even had doors, the required services, and it was in operation. Of course he couldn't believe this, but he knew it was real. He just didn't understand what had happened. He took the opportunity to stay and witness the service that was being conducted by a pastor. He also didn't know where he had come from. He wanted to see in detail the latest arrangements when, after constantly reviewing, he realized that for a Catholic chapel, it didn't have a single image of Christ or the Virgin. That is, there were certain phrases on the walls or symbols very similar to a cross, but it wasn't exactly that. However, that was all. It didn't have a single figure of saints, virgins, nothing, no particular reference other than that. So he kept his comments to himself until they finished, and once that service concluded, he approached the other priests to ask them about the changes. To his surprise, they responded that it had been like that for a long time, and it was impossible that he was just noticing it now. Yes, they were basically telling him that he was the absent-minded one, his great-great-grandfather, the friend of Uncle Pete, since he seemed to be the stranger in his own town. At that time, he had no family there, so it was more complicated. Even so, he didn't tell anyone what he remembered or what he had dreamed. He just sat thinking on one of the church benches. Suddenly, he felt someone touch his shoulder and then whisper in his ear, "I told you so." With the same forest-like voice the woman in black from his dream had, but when he turned around he saw no one. Although this was enough for him to understand that this had not been divine work, but quite the opposite. From there, several people from the town, including all my family and Pete's, don't go to that chapel because it's not entirely. It just can't be called the house of God, the neighbor added, while Pete looked at me smiling, wanting to notice my reaction to this story. Then both of them explained to me how this story they were telling me was completely real. It had been lost over time through the generations, although there were those who wanted to prevent that from happening at all costs, since according to them, that would be the objective of whoever finished it quickly. His great-great-grandfather retired from the priesthood because of that, but he never tired of insisting that that chapel had not been finished with God's help, but with his enemies or something else's. And what drove him most crazy was the fact that he was the only person who remembered how things were before that night. While things hadn't changed much, at least he was the only one who knew that chapel wasn't like that and appeared brand new, magically overnight. Because for the others, it was normal to see it that way, filling him with pure frustration, driving him away from Catholicism. They told me that chapel has changed a lot now. They've renovated it several times, and even Uncle Pete assures me it was real. Maybe whoever built it overnight isn't there anymore, but they still don't go. For them, God is not in that chapel. The neighbor's words echoed in my mind as we sat there in the New Mexico heat, the weight of his family's history settling over us like the afternoon shadows. I looked toward the direction of the chapel, hidden somewhere beyond the mesa, and wondered what other secrets these small communities kept buried in their adobe walls and ancient memories. Uncle Pete raised his beer in a mock toast. To mysteries we'll never solve, he said with that same easy smile. But I could see something deeper in his eyes now, something that spoke of generations carrying burdens they couldn't quite explain, only passed down like precious and terrible heirlooms. As the sun began to set over the high desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, I realized that some stories aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed and remembered, carried forward by those brave enough to speak them aloud to strangers who might, just might, believe. My father is a lawyer who practices real estate law here in Charleston. About 2 years ago, he worked with a client on something so bizarre that we still can't fully explain it. Before I begin, I should mention that my father asked permission to share this story. The client agreed, but with one condition, that we not use his real name. He also added that if anyone else has experienced something similar, he'd really like to know about it. This man lives in Myrtle Beach and owns 2 properties. One he inherited from his parents, a modest beach cottage near the pier. The other he built himself on a lot he purchased in 2020, right after the pandemic when property values dipped and he saw an opportunity. His plan was straightforward. Build a vacation rental house that he could list on Airbnb and VRBO to generate some extra income during the summer tourist season. It's a common practice along the South Carolina coast. Plenty of people make their living renting out beach houses to families from Charlotte and Atlanta who just want to spend a week lounging by the pool and forgetting about their problems. The property went live on the platforms, and for the first couple of bookings, everything went smoothly. Then came the first red flag. Airbnb contacted him saying that guests had reported someone lurking around the house. They said it appeared to be the owner himself. At first, he assumed it was a misunderstanding, but Airbnb asked for evidence to clear it up. How do you prove you weren't somewhere? He didn't even have a chance to respond before it happened again. Different guests, same complaint. They insisted that a man had been peering through windows and trying to open doors. This time, the platform penalized him with a warning. His listings rating dropped, and potential bookings started canceling. The third incident was the final straw. Airbnb suspended his listing entirely because yet another group of guests swore that an unknown man had been stalking the property. This time around the backyard, hiding behind the palmetto trees, jiggling the door handle like he was determined to get inside. One of the guests managed to take a photo, and it was him. Or someone who looked exactly like him, my father's client peering through a window of his own rental property. The problem was, it really wasn't him. Determined to get to the bottom of this, he decided to conduct his own investigation. One evening around 6 o'clock, he drove out to the house. He parked down the street and waited in his truck for a while. But first, he went inside and turned on all the lights to make it look like the house was occupied, hoping to see who might show up. He sat there for over an hour, watching the house from his truck. Eventually, he decided to go inside to use the bathroom before driving the 45 minutes back to Myrtle Beach. He unlocked the door and went in. He used the restroom, then grabbed a Pepsi that previous guests had left in the refrigerator. That's when he heard it, a clear sound of footsteps on the roof above him. Heavy, deliberate steps moving from one end of the house to the other. His heart started racing. Then another sound came from the backyard. Someone or something was out there, moving from palmetto tree to palmetto tree like they were playing some kind of game. He called 911, locked the door behind him, and decided to wait by his truck on the street with the keys in his hand and his phone pressed against his chest. Within minutes, to his surprise, a police cruiser arrived. But before he could explain the situation, before he could even give them the address, the officers grabbed his arms, pushed him against the patrol car, and handcuffed him. He didn't get to say a single word. He tried to explain that he was the one who had called for help, but they said no. The person who filed the report was in another patrol car, and they were taking him in to file charges. But how was that possible? The report matched perfectly. His clothing, his build, his demeanor, even the way he walked. When they arrived at the police station, instead of listening to his story, they searched him and confiscated his phone, wallet, and keys. He spent 3 hours in a cold holding cell where nobody explained anything to him. When they finally released him, an officer simply told him he was free to go, that the person who had filed the complaint had mysteriously disappeared. They handed him back his phone, but the screen was cracked. His wallet was empty, no cash, no credit cards. He had to take a taxi back to the rental house to get his truck. When he arrived, the first thing he felt was a strange chill in his stomach when he realized his vehicle wasn't where he'd left it. His heart sank because if someone had stolen it, it would have to be the same person who had been lurking around the house. Without a phone to call his family or report the theft, and without money for another taxi, it took him a while to find a cab driver willing to take him home on the promise of payment when they arrived. He finally got back to his house in Myrtle Beach around 4 in the morning. The truck was there, parked exactly where it should be. Nobody had broken into it, nobody had scratched it. It looked like it had never been moved, which was impossible. Someone had to have driven it back. His wife was waiting outside for him, but she had a strange expression on her face. When she saw him, she didn't show relief, she showed fear. He asked what was wrong, but she turned the question back on him with the same anxiety. She couldn't answer. He was about to tell her about being arrested and everything that had happened that night, but she seemed to have her own concerns. They went inside together. Sitting at the kitchen table were his children, his sister-in-law, and someone else, someone who was nearly identical to him. They barely had time to react. The stranger looked at him for a second before lunging toward the door. When he passed my father's client, he shoved him so hard that he fell to the floor, almost like he was running away from something. He ran out the front door. My father's client got up immediately, filled with a mixture of rage and terror, and chased after him. By the time he reached the corner, an unfamiliar pickup truck picked the man up before he could catch him. They disappeared into the darkness of the street. Everyone returned to the living room to try to make sense of what had just happened. The stranger had been talking with them, had been there terrifying the family all night before the real owner arrived home. When they heard his voice, when they watched him move, when they noticed tiny details, the family knew it wasn't really him. But the resemblance was so close they had no way to explain it. It was as if he had suffered some kind of accident that had changed him, or like he was the wrong version of someone who should have been somewhere else. They filed police reports and lawsuits, but there was never any conclusive evidence. Nobody ever found the person who had been there. He never appeared again. The house sat empty for a while, until one day they lent it to a cousin for a vacation. She and her friends said everything was peaceful, except for one detail that made her and the whole family think again about that night. Once, when they looked toward the window, they caught sight of a woman peering in from outside. They described her with the same features as my father's client's wife. She looked familiar, so when they went outside to greet her, she was already gone. The family sold that rental house within 6 months. My father's client now sticks to his inherited cottage and has no plans to ever get back into the vacation rental business. He says some properties just aren't meant to be shared with strangers, and that there are things about ownership that go deeper than what's written on a deed. Sometimes, he told my father, when you build something new on old land, you're not just constructing walls and a roof. You're creating a space that can be filled by things you never invited in. And once they find a way in, they might decide they like what you've built more than you do. My name is Lewis Anderson, and I'm a biologist with more than 10 years of experience working on expeditions through all kinds of ecosystems. I've traveled through the forests of Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and other places where the green and humidity envelop you. But none of my experiences compared to what I lived in the Pacific Northwest forests, that time when I was trapped by a tropical storm. I want to make it clear that I'm not superstitious, nor do I believe in legends or scary stories. But what happened that night in the forest changed me, and even today, when I close my eyes, the sound of the storm mixes with something I never understood. It was in mid-September, the rainiest season of the year in the region. I had been called by a team of ecologists to investigate a remote area, little explored in the southern part of the state. The idea was to study the biodiversity in that part of the forest, document the species, and help in the creation of a possible natural sanctuary. I would take care of the surveys, coordinates, and orientation of the group, while they focused on flora and fauna. The trip began without major problems. The first day was calm, the sun was present, the air hot, and the song of birds mixed with the constant murmur of the river. We advanced along a narrow path on muddy terrain where the vegetation, so dense, barely allowed daylight to reach the ground. There was something overwhelmingly beautiful about the forest, but also something disturbing, as if everything were in constant vigilance. The people from the nearby town had warned us about the storm, but I didn't pay much attention to them. Tropical storms are common in the region, and although the rain can be intense, it generally doesn't last more than a few hours. What we didn't know, and what no one warned us about, is that this storm wouldn't be like the others. The second day, when we were crossing a fast-flowing river to reach a small research camp, the sky began to darken strangely. The clouds grouped rapidly, as if nature itself were accelerating the process. At first, the sound of the storm was just a rumbling whisper in the distance, a distant omen. But little by little, that whisper turned into an imposing roar, covering everything in its path. We decided to take shelter under an improvised roof made with tarps, a precarious shelter that wouldn't last long against the fury of the storm. The rain began to fall in torrents, hitting the earth hard, and the wind, like a furious scream, shook the trees. But it was the sound of thunder that really disturbed us. They weren't common thunders. Instead of the usual explosion followed by rumbling, there was a pause between each thunder, a strange vibration that traveled through the forest like a distant echo, as if something else were responding to the lightning. the storm unleashed with all its fury. Despite the anguish of the moment, I tried to maintain calm and continue with my work, checking maps and records. But something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, thick, and there was something in the atmosphere, a sensation on my skin that I couldn't define. It wasn't just the heat and humidity. Something else seemed to float in the air. Suddenly, I looked up. In the darkness of the storm, between the deafening noise of rain and thunder, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or some other large mammal that had decided to take shelter near the camp. But when I looked more closely, it wasn't possible. It wasn't a creature I could identify. It moved its body strangely, almost as if it were gliding instead of walking. I gritted my teeth and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, affected by fatigue and the storm. But something in my stomach told me I wasn't alone. When the others noticed my discomfort, they looked at me strangely. I tried to downplay it, but they too were beginning to feel the same. The atmosphere was changing, not just because of the storm, but because of something else. The forest, which was usually noisy, was now silent. The song of insects, the sounds of nocturnal animals, everything had ceased. The only noise was the incessant pounding of rain. As night fell, the storm didn't cease. The wind gusts shook the shelter, and the thunder gusts seemed closer. It was then that we heard the first scream, a long scream, almost human, but at the same time inhuman. Everyone's first reaction was to look toward the trees, but we couldn't see anything. The thunder had covered it. "What was that?" asked Anna, the ecologist, with a trembling voice. "An animal, maybe," I replied, although my tone sounded forced, even to me. Fear began to take hold. No one dared to go out. The rain increased, and with it the thunder. But in the middle of that storm, something else began to become evident. A presence, something we couldn't see, but that was there. I could feel it in the air. An invisible pressure that enveloped us, that watched us. Hours later, the storm seemed to be reaching its maximum point, and we were trapped, unable to advance or retreat. It was when someone finally dared to leave the shelter. It was Roberto, the youngest of the group, who broke the silence with a tense and altered voice. "There's something outside. It's not normal." The rest of us went out after him. Through the rain, barely illuminated by flashlights, we saw something that wasn't there before, a dark figure at the edge of the camp moving erratically. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a human. It was like a shadow that moved, but with a form that couldn't be defined well. Something in its nature made our hair stand on end. There was no time for more. The figure disappeared before we could react. The next thing we knew was that the wind calmed down suddenly. Silence again covered the forest, and in that silence, a sound much closer than the thunder was heard. Something or someone was sliding through the undergrowth. Terrified, we took refuge again in the improvised shelter with the flashlights turned off. The sensation that we were being watched intensified. Every creak of branches, every gust of wind made us jump because we knew we weren't alone. Something was in the forest, and it wasn't part of the storm. The next morning, the storm had ceased, but the traces of what we had lived remained alive in our memory. When we tried to leave, to return to our starting point, we found the tracks of what had clearly been following us during the storm. Human tracks, but with a strange pattern, as if the person who had left them had dragged themselves more than walked. I don't know what that was. Nobody knows. We've never talked about it in public. To this day, the memories still haunt me. The storm wasn't just a storm. The forest had something else to hide, and we didn't discover it completely. I only know that when the rain falls, and I hear the roar of thunder, I still feel that something hides among the shadows, waiting. What I want to tell you tonight takes place at the company where I work, which is an automotive assembly factory in Detroit, where we do a lot of work with car parts, from assembly to quality control, shipping, and other things. Most of us are on the assembly line, which is where I've been for a couple of years on the morning shift. Although sometimes I modify it based on the company's requirements, which honestly isn't a bother as long as they give us advance notice, since it's never too much to work under different conditions than what we're used to. Well, that's how I see it. I mainly allow myself this because the night shift is much more peaceful than the others, since there usually isn't as much noise, and the temperature is more tolerable. On the other hand, the employees on that shift are more relaxed, so much so that I made good friends there. One of them was Mr. Ralph. I'm changing his name for something you'll hear about later. A man of about 50 years, who had a carefree, youthful, and very joking attitude that made the shift more bearable for us, entertaining us with his antics, or listening to the typical song he was always whistling. That's why a couple of months ago, when I learned that Ralph was missing, I offered my time and resources to help in whatever way I could. I didn't stop sharing his information on my social media or accompanying his family in whatever they needed. My other coworkers were doing this too, but there's no trace of him. The last thing known is that he left for work at 10 at night, and no one has seen him since. He was a divorced man with 3 children. However, he lived in an apartment in a neighborhood near the factory, which only had one pretty narrow path to get there if you were walking. Of course, besides the main avenue. I clarify this because right next to this path, there's a huge field full of weeds and plants, land whose owner we don't know, and that many people used to pass through there, since it allows you to save a lot of walking distance. This led us to suppose that maybe Ralph had tripped over something there, since it was known that when he was running late, he would walk through that route despite how dangerous it was in the darkness. So it became the first place to search, although they found nothing that gave them a single clue. Other than that, there's nothing else to consider to know where to start looking, given that the street cameras don't have him registered either. The supervisors told us about this. It's as if he had simply vanished. However, and most surprisingly of all, a week after his disappearance, one afternoon I saw several engineers and other guys who didn't belong to the company analyzing and checking various devices we have there to register ourselves. Things like the fingerprint time clock, the computers, the ID card scanners, among other things. That's when I realized the other people were responsible for providing these services to the company, since word started spreading that the devices were malfunctioning and needed to be fixed. Even so, they maintained that operation with considerable secrecy, since they didn't tell us anything, and apparently that same afternoon it was resolved. But we saw them 3 more times that week until they eventually stopped coming, and formally, no one explained to us what had happened. I just wasn't going to be left with the mystery and started probing for information with my coworkers. Most knew the same as me, that is, nothing relevant, until I was able to talk with one of the night shift line supervisors. who very seriously and even worriedly told me that she herself had reported the malfunctions. And it wasn't for less, because for days the time clock had been marking Ralph's entry, even when there was no one on the floor. The first time she heard the characteristic sound that plays once it has recognized your fingerprint, so she looked out to see who it was and asked for help with something. But when she approached, she saw no one, so she went directly to that device and checked the latest records, finding Ralph's name as the most recent entry, which did scare her at that moment. She said she tried to ignore it, thinking it had been a machine error. However, on subsequent nights, she kept hearing the noise at that time, and other employees reported the same thing to her. She didn't want to check the records again, but one of her workers insisted, so much so that he offered to accompany her, and once they went, he was also able to witness what that woman had seen. Ralph's record kept being marked at his entry time punctually. That's when they first decided to turn to experts to avoid any hasty conclusions, and hence the reason for their presence at the plant. Then, I understood that it had been fixed because we hadn't seen them around there anymore. But this coworker corrected me, saying no, that they had simply given up because they hadn't found a way to change that. Since even the men who had gone at the time the phenomenon occurred could see it with their own eyes. So despite having made the complaint, the time clock kept being heard during each night without apparent explanation. Another thing would be to deactivate that record. Something like that she explained to me, but when they talked to the area supervisor about it, he didn't want to do it. Fortunately, now that months have passed, I haven't had to go to the night shift to have my own experience with that, which honestly does scare me a bit. Not only because of how shocking the matter is regarding this last point, but because of the general tragedy of Ralph's disappearance. While we continue to be hurt by his inexplicable and mysterious departure, we have to encounter this that we have no idea how to take. Some coworkers consider it like a reminder not to stop looking for him and trying to get him to return home to his loved ones, while others believe that, on the contrary, it's Ralph saying goodbye. Maybe he did die somewhere. Whatever it means, it has us extremely desolate at the plant. Something I seriously wouldn't wish on anyone, since while we're dealing with one thing that I can't imagine for his family, we have another at the plant of a paranormal nature that we still don't know how to interpret. Although, well, maybe that won't be a problem much longer. As a final measure taken by someone higher up, they've already made the decision to install new devices and register us again to avoid any situation, clearly referring to the anomaly that happens around there at nights. This has led us to an interesting point, since while no one was comfortable with that, at least from what they told me, it made them think or believe that Ralph had arrived or was keeping them company. A sensation we'll never feel again unless one day he returns. The paranormal doesn't always provoke just one emotion. On many occasions, as we've heard on this channel, it manages to evoke different emotions at the same time. And to our regret, it often derives from unfortunate situations like these. I personally always hope for the best in any of these cases. The new equipment arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November, delivered by the same technicians who had struggled with the old system. As they wheeled in the sleek new time clocks and biometric scanners, I felt a strange sadness wash over me. It wasn't just about Ralph anymore, though his absence still hit us like a punch to the gut every time we passed his old workstation. It was about losing that last connection, that mysterious presence that had somehow made the night shift workers feel less alone in the vast emptiness of the factory floor. Sarah, the night supervisor who had first reported the incidents, stood watching as they disconnected the old fingerprint scanner. Her face was pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she signed the work orders. She'd been the one to hear Ralph's ghostly check-ins night after night, and I knew she'd grown oddly comforted by them. "It's probably for the best," she said quietly as the technicians worked. "But I can't shake the feeling we're abandoning him somehow." The other night workers nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same mix of relief and guilt that churned in my own stomach. That evening, as the first night shift tried out the new equipment, the factory felt different. The familiar electronic beep of the old system was replaced by a softer chime, and the blue LED lights cast everything in an unfamiliar glow. The workers moved through their routines mechanically, glancing occasionally at the spot where the old-time clock had been. But around 10:15, Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Supervisor to main floor," came the voice of Jake, one of the assembly line workers. "You need to see this." She hurried over to find Jake standing in front of the new biometric scanner, his face white as a sheet. On the digital display, clear as day, was an entry record timestamped at exactly 10:07. The name on the screen read, Ralph Morrison. But the factory database showed his employment as terminated due to disappearance. The new system shouldn't have had his information at all. As word spread through the plant, workers gathered around the scanner in hushed groups. Some crossed themselves, others just stared in disbelief. The technicians were called back, but they found nothing wrong with the equipment. The entry was there, logged and recorded, as real as any other. 6 months later, Ralph's case remains unsolved. The Detroit Police Department officially closed the investigation, citing lack of evidence and leads. His family held a memorial service, though no body was ever found. The field where we thought he might have fallen was searched 3 more times, with dogs, metal detectors, and ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. But every night at 10:07, Ralph Morrison checks in for his shift. The new equipment, the upgraded software, the complete system overhaul, none of it matters. He's there, in the digital space between the living and the dead, as punctual as he ever was in life. I've been assigned to night shift twice since then, and both times I've been there when it happens. The soft chime of the scanner, the brief blue flash of the LED, and then his name appearing on the screen like a message from beyond. It's both terrifying and oddly comforting. This proof that some part of Ralph refuses to let go. The management has stopped trying to fix it. They've accepted it as one of those inexplicable things that happen in old factories, like the elevator that sometimes stops at floors that don't exist, or the break room coffee maker that occasionally brews perfect coffee from an empty pot. But for those of us who knew Ralph, who shared jokes and stories and the quiet camaraderie of the night shift, it's more than that. It's a reminder that some connections transcend the boundaries between worlds, and that loyalty doesn't end with a heartbeat. Sometimes when the factory is quiet and the machines hum their mechanical lullabies, I like to think Ralph is still there, still watching over us, still making sure we're all safe. And maybe, just maybe, he's still whistling that same old tune, somewhere in the space between memory and mystery, between the living and the lost. My name is Ernest, and what I'm about to tell you happened just over a year ago. Since then, I haven't been the same. I work as a nature photographer, and one of my assignments took me to a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, in a remote corner of Montana, not far from the Canadian border. The idea was to stay there for a few days to capture the beauty of the snow-covered landscape. What seemed like a perfect retreat for someone who had been constantly traveling around the world. The cabin, owned by an elderly man I never met, was right at the edge of a small forest, surrounded by mountains covered in snow. The place was known for its absolute solitude, but that didn't worry me. It was the kind of place I had always sought to focus on my work. The first day was perfect. Snow covered the ground with an impeccable layer, and the cold air seemed fresh and clean. I spent the day outside taking photos of the snow-covered pines, of the animal tracks in the whiteness of the terrain. When I returned to the cabin as night fell, I prepared a simple dinner. I settled by the fireplace and spent the rest of the evening reviewing the photos I had taken. The place seemed cozy, with its aged wooden walls, the sound of the wind outside, and the crackling of the fire burning in the stove. The tranquility of the place enveloped me, but that night something changed. The storm began shortly after I got into bed. The wind blew hard, hitting the windows and shaking the branches of nearby trees. It didn't worry me too much at first. I was used to storms in remote areas. However, as the night progressed, the wind intensified, and the gusts of snow began to hit the house with such force that the sound mixed with the creaking of the walls. The storm became more violent, as if the mountain itself wanted to swallow the house. I tried to sleep, but something wouldn't let me rest. The wind gusts weren't what kept me awake, but a strange sound coming from outside. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but over time it became clearer. A dry knock, as if someone were giving small taps with a stick on the windows or on the external walls. I thought it could be the wind or perhaps an animal knocking against the structure of the house. However, the rhythm was too regular, as if someone were trying to get my attention. I got up from bed, a little irritated at not being able to rest. I looked out the window, but only saw the thickness of the storm. Snow fell hard, and the shadows of the trees moved under the weight of the wind. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, the knocking didn't stop. Each time it sounded louder, as if it were getting closer. I ignored it as best I could, thinking it was just the weather playing tricks on my mind. At 3 a.m, when the storm seemed to have reached its highest point, the noise changed. It was no longer a simple knocking. Now it was a dragging, something heavy, as if something were dragging itself across the ground, moving around the house. I felt a wave of discomfort run through me. The sound came from the back of the house, right where the storm was hitting hardest. I decided it was time to investigate. I dressed hastily. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered toward the back door. The wind whipped furiously, and the snow blinded me. As I walked toward the outside, the dragging stopped abruptly. I stood there with the flashlight in hand, listening to the wind creaking through the trees. Nothing. The sound had ceased. I thought maybe it had been a branch that had moved or some other natural thing, but my instinct told me something wasn't right. Something inside me pushed me not to return inside the house so easily. I decided to circle the house completely. I walked through the snow until I reached the front, where the storm seemed a little less aggressive. I looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I went back inside and made sure to close all doors and windows firmly. The feeling that I wasn't alone began to grow inside me. Something was moving outside, or so it seemed to me, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I decided to sit in the armchair by the fireplace and try to calm down. However, the silence that followed the storm seemed more disturbing than the noise. A couple of hours passed, and I decided to try to sleep again. But fear had taken root in me, and sleep didn't come easily. While I lay in bed, with my eyes open in the darkness, the sound returned. But this time it didn't come from outside, but from inside. A creak. It wasn't a normal creak like wood makes when it expands or contracts in the cold. It was something more, as if someone were walking down the hallway with soft but constant steps. My breathing became heavier. Panic was taking over me, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound came from the misalignment of the house beams due to the wind. Perhaps some object was moving inside due to air currents. I tried not to think about it, but when I clearly heard the living room door move slightly, I could no longer stay calm. I got up again, my heart beating hard. I walked down the hallway toward the living room, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The house was in total silence, and the storm outside seemed to have subsided. I was completely alone, or at least that's what I thought. When I reached the living room, I noticed that the door I had closed minutes before was ajar. The flashlight illuminated the edge of the door, and when I looked inside, I saw something that made the air freeze in my lungs. There were snow tracks on the floor, but not from the snow that had fallen recently. They were older tracks, as if someone had entered before me long ago. The snow that was inside was thicker and more compact. My mind began to make connections I didn't want to make. The dragging I had heard before, the tracks in the house, the door moving by itself, something or someone had been inside the house. I looked around fearing the worst, but there was no one, only the echo of the wind outside. I didn't dare stay any longer. I took my things quickly, left my camera and equipment behind, and ran to the car. The storm was still raging hard, but my instinct told me I couldn't stay there one more minute. While driving down the snow-covered road, trying to get out of that place as fast as possible, my mind couldn't stop thinking about those tracks and what had really happened in that house. I never knew if there was someone else there that night, or if it had all been a product of my fear. But the truth is that something in that place made me doubt my own solitude. And although I never returned to that site, the feeling of being watched, of not being truly alone, has never left me. My name is Michelle, and this story is real. I lived it with my sister just a few months ago. It happened in a small town where she lives, on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho. A quiet place, but still full of paranormal occurrences. My sister had just had her baby, so I went to see him and stayed there. It was her first child, and like all newborns, he cried quite a bit. The first few days nothing unusual happened, but then something started following us. On the fourth night I stayed sleeping at her house, we were awakened by the street dogs. They were barking and howling terribly. I hadn't heard such a commotion until I heard her. It was a melancholic, sharp lament. My skin crawled when I heard it because it was already close. My sister's mother-in-law, who slept in the other room, woke up and quickly entered our room, since there was only a curtain as a door. Very scared, she told us not to go out or look out the window, because the weeping woman was there. We heard more laments, very close, as if she were in front of the window. The baby started crying terribly, and all three of us held him and began praying the Lord's Prayer. The last cry was heard far away. That thing had left. That's when we sighed with relief. Several days passed, and one night, already forgetting this incident, I got up to use the bathroom around 3 o'clock. The bathroom was in the yard, almost next to the street, and since there was no fence around the house, you could see the street itself. I went in and out quickly, but when I came out, I saw a woman in white, like a bride. She was standing under the street lamp still, looking toward our bedroom window. She wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything, just standing there. There was a lot of wind, but her dress wasn't moving at all. I wanted to think it was someone from town, maybe some woman with problems. I looked down out of fear and walked like that until I reached the room. Deep down, I knew this wasn't normal, but I wanted to fool myself, so I didn't turn off the light and fell asleep like that. When I woke up, the first thing I did was open the window and look over there, but she was no longer there. However, that same night, everything got worse. At 3:15, the baby started crying. This time it wasn't hunger or diaper or colic. It was a different cry, one we hadn't heard before. It was like he was scared. My sister and I went to see him in the crib, but he wasn't there. And then we heard a terrifying cry, a cry like the fourth night in the street, but this time it came from the yard. We were paralyzed. The mother-in-law came quickly, and then we heard the baby's cry, but also in the yard. We ran, and the first thing we noticed was the door slightly open. We quickly went out to the yard, and there in the middle was the baby lying on the ground without clothes. And next to him, that figure. It was her, the one I had seen under the street lamp, the weeping woman. A tall, thin woman dressed in white, with a long veil covering her face. We were so shocked to see her that we couldn't move. It was like our bodies refused to react, like something had stopped us cold. My sister, through tears, screamed her son's name and said many curse words. It was like that broke the spell, like that filled us with courage. That specter, who was a few yards from us, began to cry, but the sound reached you, and suddenly cold air hit you. And in a blink she disappeared, she vanished. It was her, the weeping woman. We grabbed the baby, and he had no scratches, no bruises from falling. All three of us were terrified, a fear I had never felt in my life. With the screams we made that day, even the neighbors came out of their houses and came to the yard to see us. Nobody believed us that we had seen the weeping woman face to face. The next day, we went to a church to baptize the baby. Believe me, since then we haven't heard that specter close by again. Now we even do everything the neighbors told us. Put scissors under the baby's pillow, put a red ribbon on him, put his clothes on backwards. You know, things they used to do to protect the child. I used to be skeptical. I even laughed at these practices. But maybe there's a reason they say it and a reason they do it. I'm Andrew Hernandez, a communications engineer. And the reason I'm here writing this is because after what happened at the remote research station in northern Alaska, I don't know if I'll ever be able to sleep peacefully again. I'm alive, yes, but the images of what occurred, the sounds I heard at that station continue pursuing me to this day. I received an offer I couldn't refuse, a job at a research station in Alaska, far from everything. The project consisted of studying extreme weather conditions and how they affected radio transmissions. I knew the work would be hard, but it didn't matter to me. The salary was high, and beyond that, I'd always had a fascination with those solitary and desolate places, as if I wanted to test myself in an environment where nature is the only owner. The station was located about 150 kilometers north of the nearest civilization, a point on the map where silence seemed eternal and snow never stopped falling regardless of the season. At first, the routine was what one might expect. Long workdays, equipment checks, communication monitoring. My colleagues were a small but varied mix of scientists and technicians. They were all focused people, often quiet, but that didn't surprise me. We all knew why we were there. Lewis, a middle-aged meteorologist, was the first to greet me each morning with a cup of coffee and a smile. Dr. Melina, an expert in biology, often immersed herself in her research on local fauna. Although she rarely found anything new, since animals seemed to have moved away from the station. Elena, the team leader, had a strong personality, but was always professional. The team wasn't large, but coexistence was decent, and days passed predictably. However, that changed one night, a night that now seems so distant and yet so vivid. It was after a particularly long day, where wind gusts were more intense than normal, and the snowstorm covered the entire horizon, leaving us trapped inside the compound. At first, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but when the storm didn't cease, we realized we might be trapped there much longer than we had planned. It was around 3 in the morning when I woke up due to a strange noise coming from the hallway. I got up with some difficulty due to sleep and left my room. At first, I thought it was the wind hitting the building walls, as usually occurred during the strongest storms, but something in the way the sound resonated made me uncomfortable. It was different, more human. The hallway was dark, and emergency lights barely illuminated the path. I decided to go to the control room, where we normally all gathered during the nights. There I found Lewis, who was standing, looking through the windows that faced outside. He seemed in a trance. I didn't ask him anything at first, I just approached, but he didn't even look at me when I spoke to him. "Lewis, everything okay?" I asked, my voice somewhat hesitant due to fatigue. Lewis responded with an absent look, as if he wasn't there. "I think something is moving outside, but I can't see it well." I looked toward where he was pointing, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The storm was so dense that we could barely see a few meters outside the building. Snow lashed the windows with fury, as if trying to invade us. But something in Lewis's voice disturbed me, something I couldn't identify, as if something was about to happen. That same night at 4 in the morning, Melina disappeared. There was no noise, no signs of struggle, nothing. She simply vanished, leaving behind only a coat in the hallway, as if she had left hastily. No one, not even security, could find her trail in the snow. The strangest thing was that when we checked the security cameras, none had captured anything. No movement was seen in the hallway during the hours when Melina supposedly would have disappeared. Fear began to hover over us. Tension grew. Previously normal conversations became shorter. The atmosphere at the station became unbearably dense, as if the storm not only affected the climate, but also everyone's morale. The next morning, the wind continued roaring outside, but the building's interior was still tense, as if we were waiting for something. When I tried to communicate with the operations base in the nearest city, the radio emitted nothing but static. This wasn't something that had happened before. In all my reviews, transmissions had always been stable. The worst was yet to come. During the following night, when the storm seemed calmed, Alina, the team leader, also disappeared. In the same way, she left behind her jacket, her boots, even the laptop she was working with. She left no trace, as if she had vanished into thin air. This time panic was palpable. No one knew what to do or where to start searching. By then, rational explanations were no longer sufficient. We looked at each other without knowing if any of us would be the next to disappear. Over time, even stranger things began to happen. Footsteps were heard on the ceiling, but when going up to investigate, nothing was found. The cameras continued recording nothing out of the ordinary. But we couldn't avoid feeling that we were being watched, that something was there with us, waiting for us to get lost in the storm. It was after a week, while we were trying to maintain calm, that I also disappeared, not in the same way as the others, not in an instant without trace. My disappearance was much more gradual, a descent in which hours seemed to stretch in a way that made me doubt my own perception. I spent long periods in the dark hallways without knowing if I was walking or simply imagining I was doing so. The other team members looked at me with suspicion, as if I too was part of the strange phenomenon. Until one night, while walking in search of answers, the storm engulfed me. Or so I believed. The wind howled so loudly that it became impossible for me to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. When I woke up, I was outside the station in the snow with vision clouded by wind. I had walked so far that I couldn't even recognize the building. And the worst of all, I didn't remember how I had gotten there. What I know is this: when I returned, there was no one left. The station was empty, and the silence was so deep that the sound of my own steps resonated in every corner. I could never find a logical explanation for what occurred. Neither the traces in the snow, nor the cameras, nor the equipment we installed to monitor everything recorded anything strange. They simply disappeared without leaving anything more than the echo of the storm. And while I write this, I wonder if I'll ever understand what happened at that station. In that place so remote, so desolate, were the extreme conditions of Alaska what drove us crazy? Or was there something else? Something we never managed to identify? I don't know, but something in that place, something in the wind was waiting for us. And if I ever return, I fear I won't be alone. Months passed since I returned home, but the nightmare never left me. No one believed my story when I told them what happened at the research station. The scientists and technicians who were there with us had also disappeared as if they had never existed. The police did their part. They investigated, but the results were the same. There were no traces, no tracks, no evidence that anything strange had occurred. The storm had covered everything, erasing any possible clue. I tried to continue with my life, return to routine, but all I could think about was that place. The long nights, the half-conversations with colleagues, the sensation that there was something else, something we didn't know, stalking us. For weeks I couldn't sleep well. I woke up in the middle of the night with the same sensation of unease I had in those dark hallways, with the same metallic taste in my mouth, as if I were still trapped in that distant space. Time passed, and although life seemed to continue, something had changed in me. I became more introverted, more paranoid. I began to investigate more about the station, about Alaska's extreme conditions, about meteorological phenomena that could have affected our minds somehow. But I found nothing that could explain what happened. One day, almost a year later, I received a call. It was from the government, from a research team that was working on station archives. At first, I thought they were calling to ask me more details about my colleague's disappearance, but what they told me changed everything. "Andrew Hernandez?" asked a grave voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, it's me. What's happening?" I responded, somewhat bewildered. "We're from the research team that's reviewing cases of disappearances at remote research stations in Alaska. We need to talk to you. There's something we think you should know." My heart beat hard. I couldn't avoid a chill running through my body. What did they want to tell me? Was there something I still didn't know? "What cases are you investigating?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to confirm it. "The Omega Research Station, the same one where you were. We know you were the last to be there, the last to leave, and there's something we need you to see." What came next was a long exchange of emails and calls organizing a meeting. They didn't give me details, but it was clear there was something else. They cited me at a small office in Anchorage, about 3 hours by plane. I couldn't avoid feeling that my return to that place, even if it was in another city, would bring me even closer to something I didn't want to understand. When I arrived, I met a small but competent team. A couple of analysts, a communications technician, and a couple of geography specialists who were in charge of studying storm patterns in that region. They all seemed nervous, as if they knew more than they were willing to tell. We sat in a small room with maps spread on the table. They looked at me in silence for a few seconds before one of them, a tall man with dark hair and serious face, began to speak. "Andrew, thank you for coming. We know it hasn't been easy for you, but we need to understand what happened at Omega Station, what occurred to your team, to your colleagues. After reviewing the files, we found something unusual. We believe there was an anomaly that affected communications and that somehow is connected to the disappearances." My hands tensed on the table. I tried to stay calm, but that man's words deeply disturbed me. What did they mean by anomaly? Was it something that had been hidden? Anomaly. What exactly do you mean? I asked, feeling anxiety begin to grow in my chest. The man nodded as if he already knew the reaction I would have. There's a specific zone in the mountains near the station. Something in the terrain seems to interfere with electromagnetic waves, but it's not something common. None of the measurement equipment had recorded anything strange until after the disappearances. It seems, he hesitated for a moment, that the terrain in that zone is altered somehow. Not uncommon. I couldn't understand it. Altered how? The communications technician sitting next to him leaned forward. We received a recording. It's a transmission from one of the security cameras, those that were installed in the station's exterior areas. At first we thought it was a system failure, but then we heard it. It's a type of interference, a kind of irregular sound we couldn't identify, but it's on the same frequency used by team communications. I was frozen. The sound, the same one I had heard that night when I woke up due to the strange noise. The steps that weren't steps, Lewis's voice, the voices on the radio. All of that was part of something I didn't understand. "Can I hear the sound?" asked the technician, and he showed me a recording. What I heard left me speechless. It was a low buzz, interrupted by what seemed like a distant murmur, as if someone was speaking through a filter, but the words were incomprehensible. For a few seconds, everything seemed to have been distorted. But then, in the most disturbing moment, something was heard that froze my soul. A soft and distant laugh that seemed to resonate in my head long after the recording stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if that place, the station, was alive, as if something was trying to communicate with us, something that wasn't human. What we're saying is that we believe the terrain in that zone has a magnetic or geophysical property that can affect the human psyche. People begin to behave erratically, to lose contact with reality, and effects are amplified over time. It's possible that was what caused your colleague's disappearance. The word psyche hit me hard. Then I understood. It wasn't something supernatural. There weren't strange beings or hidden forces. It was the very nature of the place that had played a trick on us. The station, the storm, the isolation, all of that combined had destroyed us slowly until we no longer knew what was real. So the disappearances, it wasn't an error, I asked, my voice trembling. It wasn't the place. And unfortunately, we're not the first to find something like this in this region. Only over time do effects intensify. What occurred there, Andrew, has happened before, but we didn't know it. I left that office with my mind overwhelmed. My head kept spinning, trying to understand what they had told me, what had happened. Everything had been caused by something as simple as a geophysical alteration, something so insignificant, but at the same time so devastating. I know I'll never forget what happened at Omega Station. I can't stop thinking about my colleagues, but now, for the first time, I understand what happened to us. The place changed us, made us lose contact with everything we knew. And although now I know what occurred, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that sound, that distant laugh, or the whisper that seemed to call me in the solitary nights of the station. In 2015, I got my first real job while I was still finishing college. It was at a corner bodega in Brooklyn, helping customers, restocking the refrigerated cases and shelves, and sometimes standing outside to make sure too many people didn't come in at once. There was this woman who came in every day. She lived around the corner in one of those old brownstone buildings near Prospect Park. She had money, you could tell from her clothes and the way she carried herself, but she was down to earth in how she talked to people. She rented a small studio apartment above a laundromat, even though she owned a spacious 2-bedroom place in Park Slope. I learned this from Diana, the daughter of the woman who owned the bodega, because this lady I'm telling you about barely spoke to anyone. She kept to herself, always seemed withdrawn and private. One day she was walking toward the store, but before she even stepped inside, she stopped and stared up at a maple tree on the sidewalk. She was crying, her hands were shaking. It looked like something had just happened to her, but when we asked what was wrong, she just looked down and stayed silent. You could see a kind of terror in her that made you think she wanted to scream, but couldn't find her voice. She whispered to us that they wouldn't leave, that they didn't want to go away. Diana asked what was happening, and she managed to explain that the tenants in her apartment wouldn't move out. Diana, who was the kind of person who got involved in everyone's business, told her not to worry. She could get a couple of guys to go over there and throw those jerks out for just a case of beer. It seemed like the kind of neighborhood solution where everyone handles their problems their own way. But the woman, still trembling, managed to explain that it wasn't that simple. She had rented the apartment to a couple in their late 20s who, at first, paid their rent on time. She never found out what they did for work or how they made their living. Now, she regretted not doing a formal lease, not going through a rental agency, not doing proper background checks. One night, a stranger called and told her to come to the apartment immediately. They didn't say what was wrong, just that it was urgent. At first, she thought it might be a domestic dispute or a party that had gotten out of hand. But when she arrived, reality hit her like a punch to the gut. The female tenant had caught her boyfriend with another woman. She went into a rage and pulled out a gun. According to the neighbors, she spent the whole afternoon screaming that she was going to kill them both. Even so, nobody called the police. Nobody did anything until 11 o'clock that night, when the shots rang out. First one shot, a scream, a long silence, and finally one last gunshot. They took the bodies away that same night, and the landlady had to clean up. When she entered the apartment after they removed the bodies, she found the living room transformed into a grotesque scene. The sofa where they had argued was still marked by dark splatters that had reached the wall. The floor, once polished and bright, was now dull from a thick puddle that seemed to have seeped toward the crack under the door. She had to put on rubber gloves and fill a bucket with bleach to try to erase all those signs of violence, to clean where there had once been life, where seconds before there had been screaming, where someone's final breath had become trapped in the air. The smell lingered even when she opened all the windows. It wasn't a clear scent, but a mixture of iron, sweat, and fear that wouldn't disappear. At first she thought it would be enough to mop the floor and change some sheets, but this was much more extensive. The dark liquid had reached the baseboards, stained the wood, splattered the ceiling. It seemed like the violence had marked every corner so that nobody could forget. We listened to the story in silence, horrified, not knowing what to say, until she added something we couldn't quite process. They don't want to leave. They're still there. Diana, with an almost supernatural calmness, asked. They stayed to haunt the place. Their souls got trapped. She said it like she was certain that violent death breaks invisible rules that we should all know about. Can we go see? She asked with a determination that gave me goosebumps. I couldn't imagine why we'd want to go, but there we were an hour later, walking about 12 blocks with the woman in almost complete silence. When did it happen? We asked on the way. It's been a while now, she said. The woman led us to a row of well-maintained brownstones with renovated facades. We climbed some stairs, and she brought us to the door of apartment 3B. It smelled like fresh popcorn. The microwave was just finishing making a bag. Is that them? Diana asked. The apartment was empty. We couldn't see any living person. Even so, before she could answer, someone walked past us. Not like a cold breeze, but with all the weight of a human body. We felt the human warmth as they passed, caught a whiff of cheap deodorant mixed with sweat and old cologne. It felt so close, we almost lost our breath. The figure was a man who ignored us completely. We saw him for 1 or 2 seconds as he came out of a bedroom, and then he shut himself behind another door. Diana, always brave, walked to the bathroom, knocked out of habit, and opened it with a jerk. Nobody was there. I stood there, unable to understand if it was a ghost, a memory trapped in the house, or simply something that shouldn't be living among us. Diana crossed herself when she heard the whole story. She was quiet for a moment, and then made a recommendation they should talk to Juanita, who could probably help. Juanita was an older woman who lived near the bodega and did spiritual cleansings. She helped people with things that nobody else could fix. The apartment owner already knew her. In fact, she had already brought her once to try to purify the place, but it hadn't ended well. The woman told us that Juanita had entered the apartment one morning determined to confront whatever was there. She went into the bedroom while the owner waited in the living room. At first, you could only hear prayers in a low voice, but within a few minutes came a scream that shook the entire apartment. Juanita came out of the bedroom disheveled, with her face distorted and her blouse torn. She couldn't say a word, just raised her hand to indicate that she wasn't going to continue, and left almost dragging her feet. The owner invited us to enter that bedroom. The first thing we noticed was a black stain on the ceiling next to the light fixture that the woman had apparently forgotten to clean. At the foot of the bed was a clump of hair, a dark, tangled handful that didn't belong to her. "I don't think we can help you," Diana said when she heard everything. "I know," the woman replied in a flat voice, "but I didn't want to say it before." We were leaving when we heard laughter from the other bedroom. It wasn't human, neither a woman's nor a man's voice. It was a strange sound that echoed off the walls. Then old music started playing, first quietly, then so loud that the windows vibrated. We hurried outside. The woman stayed there on the stairs with her head down. We said goodbye and managed to tell her that if we found anything or knew someone who could help, we'd come back. Days went by without hearing from her. Diana mentioned it to a friend from her CrossFit gym who put her in touch with a Cuban guy who helped with similar situations. We tried to go look for the woman to give her the news. I called out to her from the street so I wouldn't have to go knocking door to door in the neighborhood. Finally, a neighbor who got tired of my shouting said I could go up to the second floor, apartment 23, and threw me the key. I knocked for almost 20 minutes, but nobody answered. I told Diana when I got back. It seemed strange to her, especially since the woman hadn't been to the store in days. 3 more days passed before we tried again. Now, with more concern, we decided to go check the Park Slope apartment. We dared to go up and knock on the door, but nobody answered. A neighbor who was passing by stopped us and said that nobody lived in that place. She offered to give us the owner's phone number if we were interested in the apartment, but warned us not to waste our time looking for her. She told us that something horrible had happened in that apartment, that nobody lives in that property, but that every night it seems like there's someone inside. You can hear things that shouldn't be heard. Look for another place to rent. She thought we were interested in renting the apartment. We left in silence. As we were walking away, Diana turned to look at the window. She didn't say anything to me at that moment, but later she confessed that she had seen the woman looking out at us from the window, watching us before disappearing again into the darkness. The bodega owner told us a week later that the woman's studio apartment above the laundromat had been empty for months. The laundromat owner said she had paid 6 months in advance, but never returned after the first week. Her belongings were still there, clothes in the closet, food in the small refrigerator, toiletries in the bathroom. Like she had just stepped out and planned to come right back. Diana and I went by the Park Slope building one more time, about a month later. The same neighbor was sweeping her front steps and recognized us. She shook her head when she saw us approaching. Still looking for that apartment? She asked. I told you not to bother, but since you keep coming around, I should probably tell you something else. She glanced up at the windows of the apartment where we'd seen the woman. The lady who owns that place. She's been dead for 2 years. Died in a car accident on the Belt Parkway. Her family's been trying to sell it ever since, but nobody wants to buy it. And nobody can figure out who's been paying the utilities, because the lights are on every night. We never went back to that building. Diana quit the bodega job a few months later and moved to New Jersey. I finished college and got a job in Manhattan, but I still think about that woman sometimes. About whether she was real, whether she was trapped in that apartment the same way her tenants were, whether some places just hold onto people who have nowhere else to go. Good evening. I'm a huge fan of your channel and listen to all the stories. I finally found the courage to write and share a story that still terrifies me to this day. Just thinking about it gives me chills. This happened in July of 2019 in rural Tennessee, near a small town called Cedar Ridge. I live in Nashville, but my dad has been living in Cedar Ridge for many years. My name is Alina, and I'm 40 years old. In this story, I won't mention my father's real name, since he's well known in this small town. As usual during my July vacation, I spend some time at my dad's house. That summer, I brought along my friend Brianna, who also had time off during the same period. Every time I visit, my dad and I plan to go fishing together. It's something he does regularly, and I absolutely love it too. These vacations were no different. I arrived in town on a Thursday, and that same day we planned a fishing trip to a pond for the next day. My dad wanted to fish at night since he wanted to show me how to catch catfish. On Friday morning, we woke up early to enjoy time with the family. Right after lunch, before noon, we sat in the backyard to have a beer since the heat in town, even in summer, can be intense. We spent time in the backyard talking. There was me, my dad, his wife, Brianna, and his stepson. My dad spent the afternoon getting our fishing gear ready. He sorted the rods, organized the hooks, and prepared the bait. My dad's stepson, named Marcus, asked where we were going fishing. My dad replied, "We're going fishing at a pond toward the town of Millbrook, past the cornfields." Marcus responded, "You're crazy to take the girls there at night. It's thick woods out there. There are wild boars, coyotes, snakes, everything." My dad then answered, "They'll be with me. I'm taking the flashlight and machete to clear the path." Marcus even tried to make my dad change his mind about the trip, but my dad is stubborn and wouldn't budge. Besides, Brianna and I were excited to go, and he wanted to make us happy. My dad's wife, whom I affectionately call Aunt Sarah, is also an excellent angler, but she wasn't enthusiastic about going fishing with us. I asked her, "Aunt Sarah, why aren't you coming fishing with us?" She smiled, looked down, and then said, "I like going to the woods during the day. I've already told your father. At night, there are many things that aren't of this world wandering around." My dad laughed and asked her to stop with the tall tales so she wouldn't scare us. My aunt said she wouldn't risk going out beyond the dangers of wild animals. She had heard stories of various strange things that happened out there. I didn't pay much attention to the stories and said to Brianna, "Oh, this is just small-town folk trying to scare us. They think because we live in Nashville, we're not used to woods and fishing." The subject passed, and we continued talking about other things. Around 3 in the afternoon, we heard someone calling at the gate. It was a friend of my dad's, also from town, and his fishing buddy. His name was Tony. My dad's friend entered carrying his bicycle and sat in the backyard chairs with us. I had met Tony before during other visits to my dad's place, and honestly, I never really liked him. All the other times I was there, and Tony came to talk to my dad would ask me to go inside and wait in the house. I never understood why, but it must be a father thing to protect his children. This time, my dad didn't ask me to go inside. I was able to participate in the conversation. Tony soon found out about the fishing trip and offered to come with us. My dad felt awkward and accepted his request, but said he needed to be back by 6 in the evening to leave, and if he was late, he wouldn't come with us. As soon as Tony left, my dad said, "Don't worry, daughter. Tony is always late for appointments. It'll be you, Brianna, and Dad. Before 6, we'll load up the pickup and leave." As my dad promised, by 5:30, the pickup was already loaded with fishing gear, well before the time arranged with Tony. My aunt gave me a water bottle to take and asked me to wear long sleeves, because even at night, the mosquitoes near the lake are aggressive. She also told us to stay close to my dad and not wander away from him for any reason. Just as my dad pulled the pickup out of the garage, we saw Tony pedaling his bicycle toward us. Wouldn't you know it, the man had arrived early. I noticed my dad was annoyed when he saw him, but he didn't say anything. He asked Tony if he had brought his rods since he didn't have any to lend. I think it was just a way he found to not take him along. Tony, however, said yes, and pointed to 2 bamboo rods attached to his bicycle. My dad then asked him to get in the pickup bed, since the cab would only fit us girls. As soon as we left the town limits, we entered the county road that connects Cedar Ridge to Millbrook. Part of this road is paved, and the other part is dirt. My dad put on some country music and chatted with us. Tony was sitting in the bed. As soon as we entered the dirt part of the road, I pointed to the sky for my dad. "Look, Dad, how beautiful." In the sky appeared a round, yellowish moon. It was a full moon. Brianna immediately took out her phone to take a photo of the moon. My dad, as soon as he saw the moon, slowed down the car and said to me, "Daughter, stay close to Dad at the lake. Don't leave my side. Like Marcus said back there, it's thick woods. There could be animals, and close to me, Dad will protect you." I replied, "Don't worry, Dad. I'm not a child anymore. I can take care of myself," and I laughed. He then responded, "I know, daughter, but you can never be too careful. Your dad is old and has seen many things around here. Things that don't even surprise me anymore. That's why I always carry my flashlight and machete. Dad will set up your things and Brianna's next to me. You're not to stay with Tony." I looked at my friend's face, who was also confused. And so my dad ended the conversation. We entered through a farm and continued for about 20 minutes on a road between cornfields. After the crops, we reached a wooded area surrounded by tall grass. My dad parked the pickup in a clearing and said, "This is where we stop." Brianna then asked, "Are we here?" My dad smiled and said, "We've reached as far as we can drive. The rest of the way will clear a path through the woods." Each of us grabbed some things to carry. My dad went ahead with the flashlight to illuminate and a machete to clear the way through the vegetation. Behind me and Brianna came Tony. We walked about 300 feet until we reached the pond. I asked Brianna to check the time on her phone. It was almost 7 in the evening. My dad set up our things near the trail he had cleared through the woods. Tony grabbed his gear and said he was going to fish farther away. My dad then said, "Man, why are you going so far? Let's stay here fishing near the girls." Tony replied, "When there are too many people together, there's too much talking and not enough fish. I want to take my cooler home full." And so he took his things and left to walk around the lake. We watched his path for a while and soon lost him in the darkness of the night. It was just the three of us by the pond. Brianna and I kept chatting quietly and pointing to the starry sky, which is rare to see in the city where we live. About 30 minutes passed with no fish, not even a bite on the line. This began to irritate my dad, who was an excellent fisherman. "Girls, Dad is going to find a better spot to fish. Nothing's biting here. You keep talking and the fish stay away." I was upset with my dad and said, "Dad, didn't you say it's dangerous for us to stay away from you?" "Stay calm. Dad will leave the flashlight with you and the machete. If anything happens, you scream and Dad will come right away." And so he took his things and moved away. Despite it being a full moon, we couldn't see my dad or Tony anywhere else around the pond. We could only see about 30 feet around us. Brianna and I kept our lines in the water and talked quietly by the pond. After a while, Brianna really needed to use the bathroom. I told her, "Go over there at the beginning of the trail Dad cleared. There's a bush there. No one's around, it's just us." "What about your dad and Tony? What if they see me?" she asked. "Are you crazy? We can't even see where they are in this darkness. Go ahead, I'll keep watch from here." Brianna walked away to go behind the bush, and I took the opportunity to pull my rod out of the water to check if the bait was still on the hook. Not even a minute passed before she came running back. "Alina, I was peeing and heard some noises back on the trail we came from. It sounded like branches breaking, as if someone was walking." I signaled for her to be quiet. We listened for a while and heard nothing, no noise. Then I told Brianna, "That must be in your head, Bri. We're out here in the dark and it's so quiet. It must have been some branch that fell in the woods." Just as I finished saying those words to my friend, I heard a noise. It wasn't branches falling. It was as if an animal or someone was walking through the woods. They were loud noises, like footsteps. We stayed silent, not moving. Fear took over me and my legs froze. I couldn't move. Time passed and the noise stopped. Brianna laughed and patted my shoulder. "We're getting paranoid in this place. Where's your dad so we can leave? There are no fish here." I laughed and decided to agree with my friend. It must have been in our heads. I told her, "Bri, when my dad goes fishing, he forgets about time. You'll see, he'll come back loaded with fish. Let's try to catch something too." We decided to go back to fishing. We changed the dough bait on the hook for a piece of beef liver. Maybe we could catch some fish now. We sat quietly by the pond. Soon I felt a bite on the hook and pulled. It was a small catfish about the size of my hand, but it was a good start. As soon as I removed the fish from the hook, I posed, and Brianna took a photo with her phone. Right when the flash went off, we heard a growl near us. "Alina, did you hear that?" I nodded and whispered, "Stay quiet." This time it didn't stop. The growls were getting closer, with a sound of stepping through the woods, as if something was approaching. The sound we heard wasn't from a dog. It was a loud growl, like a hiss. With each growl, I felt my spine freeze from within. My friend hugged me and whispered in my ear, "What animal is that? What do we do?" I couldn't scream for my dad. If I screamed, surely the animal that was stalking us would approach. I gathered courage, put the fish on the ground, grabbed my dad's machete, and signaled for Brianna to get the flashlight. I asked her to turn on the flashlight. In a split second, the light blinded our eyes. As soon as we got used to the light, we looked down the trail, and about 120 feet from us, we saw a creature that was not of this world. It looked like a large dog, like a Doberman or Rottweiler, but it was standing on two legs. Its mouth had gigantic teeth bared at us, and drool dripped between the upper and lower jaws. The creature's eyes were yellowish, and the irises were purple or red. I noticed that the light also bothered the creature, since when Brianna trembled, the flashlight would shake and move away from that monster's eyes, and it could move. "Bri, keep the light steady," I shouted at her. "What are we going to do?" she shouted back. Although my body was frozen, unable to move, my head was racing with thoughts. Then I had an idea. I told Brianna, "Don't take the light off that monster's eyes because somehow the light is stopping it from coming here. I'm going to call Dad and we'll back away facing it. Don't forget the light." My friend was terrified, and tears were streaming down her face. Even so, she agreed and didn't take the flashlight off the creature's eyes. "Dad," I screamed at the top of my lungs. Probably my dad had already heard our commotion and was approaching us with a flare in his hand. As soon as he saw us, he signaled for us to follow him and threw the flare toward the creature. We heard a roar like pain and the sound of footsteps moving away into the woods. "Give me the machete," my dad asked desperately. As soon as I handed him the machete, my dad quickly cleared another path through the woods, and we followed the trail he made. In a few moments, we moved away from the pond and reached the pickup. Once we were safe, I asked, "Dad, do we have to go back to get Tony?" To which he replied, "Tony will keep fishing until morning. Later he'll catch a ride on the road back to town." The three of us rode back in silence. The next day in the morning, we tried to talk to my dad about what happened and described what we saw. He replied, "You girls are from the big city and aren't used to life around here. What you saw was a large wild boar, what we call a razorback. My aunt wanted to know what had happened, but my dad didn't open up space for us to talk and asked us to end the subject there. We spent another week at my dad's house and didn't go fishing again. In none of my other vacations has he invited me fishing again. Last year I asked my aunt, Aunt Sarah, why doesn't Dad invite me fishing anymore? To which she replied, I don't know, dear. After that night fishing trip you took, he put away his rods and doesn't even go fishing during the day anymore. He doesn't want anything to do with Tony either. He's turned the man away from here several times. I confess to you that I never believed in this type of story until I saw with my own eyes that creature, which in my opinion was not a wild boar like my dad claimed. After that encounter, I don't doubt anything anymore and avoid going into the woods at night. I hope you enjoyed my story. A hug and good night to everyone on the channel. My name is Roderick, and that summer afternoon still haunts my mind like a fog that refuses to lift. What began as a simple weekend getaway with my friends in the middle of our daily routine, and the discomfort of the heat ended up being something none of us could forget. Sometimes I wonder if what we experienced was just our imagination, or if something truly dark was lurking from the shadows. In any case, the tornado wasn't the only thing that trapped us that afternoon. We were in a small town in central Kansas, a place surrounded by endless wheat fields and farmland. None of us in our group knew the area well, but we were young and carefree, always looking for an excuse to make an escape. We took a car and headed to the place without major expectations. We just wanted to get away from the noise of the city and enjoy the fresh air. But as happens in these cases, everything started to go wrong when the weather changed without warning. I remember it surprised us halfway there when the sun was right above our heads, and the warm breeze became thick, heavy. "It's going to storm," said Mario, the most sensible of the group. But we never imagined it would be so soon or so strong. Suddenly, the sky darkened quickly, as if someone were turning off a giant light above us. A few seconds later, the rain began to fall, and what seemed to be a normal summer storm transformed into something much more violent. The wind whipped the wheat stalks. The rain fell in thick curtains that made it almost impossible to see beyond a few yards. Without much to do, we decided to look for shelter in an old building we saw in the distance, a construction in ruins half hidden among the trees. It seemed like a good place to take shelter until the storm subsided. At first, it seemed like the perfect refuge. It was isolated enough so that the wind and rain wouldn't reach us with force, and close enough to the road to be a quick option. It was an old building of those you see around there that seemed forgotten by time. The stone walls were thick and cracked, and the metal roof was rusted in some spots. The curious thing was that there were no signs that anyone lived there, just a broken entrance that allowed us to get in without problem. We quickly settled with our backpacks thrown on the floor and the improvised bags we brought full of wet objects. Mario took care of getting out the flashlights and provisions, while the rest of us stood, looking at the walls covered with moss and the old wood that creaked from time to time. The place had a gloomy air, but nothing that gave us real uneasiness at that moment. After all, it was just a storm, and shelter was the most logical thing. A couple of hours passed. The storm showed no mercy. The sound of the wind and rain resonated loud like a symphony of chaos. We laughed, telling silly stories, playing cards, trying to drown out the boredom. However, something wasn't right. I noticed it first. From time to time, there was a kind of strange creak, as if something or someone were walking on the roof. At first we thought it was the wind moving the old beams, but soon it began to sound too regularly. Mario, always the most rational, was the first to suggest that we could be under a poor quality roof, which explained the noises, but no one was completely convinced. The storm continued its course. As the afternoon progressed, the building began to feel darker, more claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in, and the air, despite being cool outside, inside became humid and heavy. From time to time, someone saw a shadow move in the corner of their eye, but when we turned our heads, nothing was there. At 7 in the evening, the storm hadn't yielded, and fear began to get into our guts in a subtle, persistent way. It was Pablo who began to speak in a somewhat more tense manner. "Have you noticed anything weird here?" he asked while looking toward the window, from where only darkness and rain could be seen. "I feel like something is watching us." The rest of us looked at each other, not knowing what to say. At first we laughed at his paranoia, But as the atmosphere became heavier, something inside us, unwillingly, began to take his uneasiness seriously. The electricity had gone out a good while ago, and the flashlights were our only source of light. Suddenly, one of the lights flickered several times before going out completely. Mario tried to turn it on again, but there was no luck. "It's the storm," he said, trying to calm down. But while he rummaged in his backpack looking for new batteries, I looked around and something chilled my blood. The objects around us didn't look like before. The shadows cast by the flashlights seemed to move with a life of their own, and the space, which before seemed large and empty, now seemed oppressive. Pablo, who had been sitting on the floor next to the walls, got up suddenly. "I heard something. Someone is walking outside." We all fell silent. No one had heard anything, but the tension was already so dense that even the smallest sound surprised us. Mario got up, walked to the door, and opened it suddenly. A cold wind immediately hit us, taking away the warmth that still remained inside. He looked outside, where the storm continued furious, but there was nothing. "It's just the wind," he said, although his voice sounded less sure than before. He slammed the door shut. The uneasiness took hold of us. No one dared to say anything more. The only source of light were the weak flashlights that remained, and the place seemed to close in on us. The walls creaked as if they were alive, and the air, increasingly dense, oppressed our chests. The sound of rain and wind became a distant whisper, replaced by a creak that seemed to come from the very walls, a dragged sound, as if something were being dragged across the floor. It was then that we heard a laugh, a soft laugh, almost imperceptible, as if someone were right next to us. We looked at each other, trying to rationalize what we had just heard, but there was no doubt. There was someone else in the building with us. Panic began to surface in each of us. Quickly, Mario tried to open the door again to leave, but something seemed to stop him. He was as if paralyzed. Suddenly we realized that the windows, which before were clear, were now covered by a kind of thick fog, as if the walls themselves were exhaling something. We couldn't see anything outside. A deeper cold invaded us, and the laughter returned, this time louder, clearer, as if it were mocking us. We remained silent, trembling, looking at the walls, searching for some rational explanation. But there was no longer any way to deny what we felt. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the room door slammed shut, pushed by an icy current that seemed to come from the very darkness. The storm continued its course, but for us, the shelter had stopped being safe. Every corner of the building seemed to be alive, watching us, waiting for the moment to unveil its true face. And while we tried to find an exit, something told us it was already too late to escape. I'm a trucker, and a woman appeared crying next to my truck. It wasn't just any ghost, it was the weeping woman. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years. I've crossed the entire country, from Seattle to Miami, from North Dakota down to Texas. And believe me, when you spend so many nights alone on the highway, you learn to distinguish what's really messing with your head from fatigue, and what's actually real. And what happened to me that night was real. It was a long route from Denver to Kansas City, but something went wrong and I left late from the loading dock. By the time I was near the Colorado-Kansas border, it was past 2 in the morning. I didn't want to push my body. I was already nodding off, so I pulled over at a lonely stretch. Past mile marker 218, I don't remember exactly. There was nothing around but wilderness. I pulled a bit into the brush so I wouldn't be in the way on the highway. I turned off the engine, rolled up the windows, and lay down for a while in the truck's sleeper cab. I don't know how long I slept, maybe just a few minutes, but I was woken up by a strange sound. It was a long howl, first distant and then closer. That's when I realized it wasn't an animal, it was a scream, like someone was walking through the brush. I sat up suddenly. I thought it was some lost woman or some kind of trap. I've heard stories of robbers who use recordings or pretend to be injured women. I looked out the window, but there was nobody there. However, that crying continued, clearer, closer, and there was something wrong with it. It was deep crying, full of pain. At the third scream, the birds in the trees flew away, all of them like they were fleeing from something bad. I turned on the truck's exterior lights to leave, because this gave me a bad feeling. But when I turned them on, there she was, a woman standing right in front of me on the highway, dressed in black, with loose hair covering her face. She wasn't moving, just crying and screaming. I wanted to honk the horn, but I couldn't. It was like my body wasn't responding properly. She cried once more, but I heard her very close to me, almost like she was in the passenger seat. Also, she said it with a voice that didn't seem human. It was like it came from everywhere at the same time, from the air, from the brush, from behind the highway, and from in front where she was standing. I started the truck, put it in first gear, and took off. But when I passed right where she was standing, she wasn't there anymore. I didn't hear anything else. I drove as best I could, paranoid. I was sweating cold, shaking nonstop. I had never been so scared. I reached the next truck stop around 4:40 in the morning, completely sweaty and trembling. I told another trucker who was there, an older man. He listened to me in silence and just said, "Man, you encountered the weeping woman. For those of us on the highway, sooner or later she appears to us. But if she cried close to you, it's because she was already looking for something she doesn't have. And sometimes she wants to take what she finds." Since that night, I never sleep pulled over at lonely stretches anymore. I prefer to reach a gas station and stay there where there are people. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.